What if American history wasn't just stars, stripes, and textbook tales, but squirrel invasions, secret surgeries, pigeon war heroes, and molasses tsunamis? Welcome to 101 Rare U.S. History Facts, a 2-hour descent into the weirdest, wildest corners of the American timeline. Presidents will duel, whales will explode, and entire cities will nearly vanish under sugar. This isn't the history you learned in school. It's the one they were too scared or too confused to teach. Buckle up, because America didn't just happen, it happened hard. Betsy Ross and the First Flag. It's the kind of story that's tailor-made for textbooks. A humble seamstress in Philadelphia, hunched over candlelight, carefully stitching the stars and stripes into existence while revolution swirled around her. Betsy Ross, American icon, the First Lady of the Flag. There's just one problem. It probably never happened. The tale of Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag didn't hit the public consciousness until nearly a century after the fact, when her grandson, William Canby, told the story to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1870. He didn't have documents, letters, or even a sketch. Just family lore. No one mentioned Betsy's needlework during the Revolution. Not Franklin, not Washington, not even Ross herself. But Canby's tale stuck. It fit a growing national appetite for founding myths, and who better to symbolize the birth of a nation than a widowed upholsterer quietly defying an empire with thread and cloth. The truth: the first flag was likely designed by Francis Hopkinson, a New Jersey congressman and signer of the Declaration of Independence, who even submitted a bill for his work. He asked for payment in wine. He was denied. Still, the Betsy Ross myth endures, not because it's accurate, but because it's irresistible. A tidy legend stitched from scraps, draped in patriotic nostalgia. But if the first flag's true origins are hazy, the next event on our list was anything but subtle. In fact, it smelled like milk, moved like mobs, and triggered a mini-war in Vermont dairy country, the Great Vermont Cow War of 1913. It began, as so many American dramas do, with a price. In 1913, Vermont dairy farmers found themselves strangled by falling milk prices, dictated not by supply and demand, but by powerful milk distributors. The big dairies in Boston were squeezing the little guys, paying them less and less while charging more and more to the urban consumer. The farmers were furious, and then they got organized. Enter the Dairy Farmers Union, a coalition of angry cow owners ready to raise hell. They demanded better prices and launched a strike, refusing to ship milk. But these weren't just passive protesters. They armed themselves, sabotaged milk shipments, blocked roads, dumped entire shipments of milk in acts of dairy rebellion. In one dramatic moment, Union men stormed a train depot and destroyed thousands of quarts of milk bound for the city. Newspapers dubbed it the Great Vermont Milk War, but in the past century, it's faded into obscurity. A footnote, lost beneath waves of more famous labor clashes. And yet, it was a clear expression of rural resistance, economic desperation, and a warning about monopolies. Cows may seem innocent, but mess with their keepers, and you get a quiet rebellion that leaves curdled milk and national headlines in its wake. And speaking of national hysteria, let's talk about one of the weirdest health scares to ever infect the American psyche. A red, juicy fruit feared to be deadly. Welcome to the era when Americans thought tomatoes could kill you. Tomato panic in early America. Picture this: a plump tomato, sun-ripened and glistening with dew, resting innocently on a wooden table. And next to it, a terrified early American clutching his stomach in an existential dread. Because for decades, especially in the early 19th century, many Americans genuinely believed tomatoes were poisonous. The culprit? The tomatoes' membership in the nightshade family, a botanical gang notorious for harboring deadly toxins. People associated tomatoes with belladonna and other lethal plants. Combine that with lead-based pewter plates, which could leach lead when in contact with acidic foods like tomatoes, and the fruit earned a sinister reputation. Enter Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson, a New Jersey gentleman with a taste for drama. In 1820, he staged a public stunt on the steps of the Salem courthouse. Holding a basket of tomatoes, he declared them safe, and then devoured them on the spot while the crowd gasped in horror, reportedly expecting him to keel over, frothing at the mouth. Instead, he survived, flourished even, and slowly so did the tomato's reputation. By the mid-19th century, the tomato had gone from danger fruit to culinary staple. But for a bizarre period, one of the most American ingredients was thought to be lethal. And that brings us to another anomaly in the American canon. A man who made it all the way to the top without ever walking down the aisle. James Buchanan, the bachelor president. He dined alone, or sometimes with his niece, or with political allies who never really understood him. James Buchanan, the 15th president of the United States, remains an enigmatic figure, not just for his presidency on the eve of civil war, but for his personal life, which veered sharply from the presidential norm. He is, to this day, the only lifelong bachelor to ever occupy the Oval Office. Born in 1791, Buchanan was engaged once to a woman named Anne Coleman. But something fractured between them. Some speculate scandal, others suggest cold feet. Anne died suddenly in 1819, and rumors swirled it was suicide. Buchanan never married afterward. Instead, he lived with Alabama Senator William Rufus King for over a decade. The two were so inseparable, Andrew Jackson nicknamed them Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy, a taunt dripping with 19th century innuendo. Historians still debate the nature of their relationship, with interpretations ranging from deep friendship to suppressed romantic partnership. But what's clear is this: Buchanan defied expectations. In an age obsessed with appearances, family values, and the public image of leadership, he ruled solo. A White House without a first lady, only a first niece. And while Buchanan may have kept his feet firmly planted in political decorum, American women in the 1890s were breaking new ground, or at least pedaling over it. Enter the bicycle. The bicycle craze and women's fashion revolution. It was more than a trend. It was a cultural detonation on two wheels. In the 1890s, the bicycle became a nationwide obsession, a mechanical miracle that offered speed, freedom, and mobility to the masses. But for American women, it did something more profound. It rewrote the rules of fashion, freedom, and femininity. Before bicycles, women were swaddled in corsets and floor-length skirts that practically demanded a fainting couch. But you try riding a bike with all that fabric flapping around your ankles. It was impractical and dangerous. Enter the rational dress movement, bloomers, split skirts, shorter hemlines. Suddenly, the streets were filled with women in more functional attire, pedaling past gasping bystanders and patriarchal expectations. Some men panicked. Medical journals warned of bicycle face, a terrifying new affliction said to result in permanent facial contortion from overexertion and immodesty. Religious leaders decried the bike as a gateway to sin. But women kept riding. They rode to work, to lectures, to suffrage meetings. Susan B. Anthony herself said that bicycles had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. This wasn't just about exercise. It was liberation on wheels. Steel frames and spokes forged a quiet revolution, one skirt lifted at a time. But while Americans rolled toward modernity, one stubborn geographical detail remained unchanged. The smallest state, quietly sitting in the Northeast, waiting to be underestimated. Rhode Island. Small but stubborn. Don't let the size fool you. At just 1,034 square miles, Rhode Island is the smallest U.S. state by land area, a tiny thumbprint on the map of America. But it's also one of the feistiest. From the beginning, Rhode Island didn't do things the easy way. It was the last of the original 13 colonies to ratify the Constitution. Not because it was slow, because it was stubborn, fiercely independent, suspicious of centralized power. Roger Williams founded Rhode Island in 1636 as a haven for religious dissenters, people who didn't fit in with the Puritan orthodoxy of Massachusetts Bay. It was born out of protest, out of exile, out of a desire to build something radically tolerant. That rebellious spirit never left. Even its full name, the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, carried on well into the 21st century, until finally shortened in 2020 after controversy over its colonial undertones. Rhode Island may be tiny, but it's packed tight with attitude, history, and coastline. And if you think small equals insignificant, just wait until we head west, to a time when one of the richest men in America offered to buy an entire country from the United States. Andrew Carnegie and the $20 million offer. Steel made him a titan. Philanthropy made him a legend. But Andrew Carnegie also had a lesser-known legacy, one that involved a bold, almost cinematic gesture. After the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. emerged victorious and snatched up former Spanish colonies, including the Philippines, Carnegie watched with mounting horror. He was a staunch anti-imperialist, and he put his money where his conscience was. In 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially transferring the Philippines to American control for the tidy sum of $20 million. Carnegie was so appalled by this act of acquisition that he offered to pay the U.S. government the full $20 million himself, out of pocket, if it meant giving the Philippines their independence. Let that sink in. One man ready to spend a fortune to cancel an empire. He even suggested he'd do it as a gift to the Filipino people. The offer, predictably, went nowhere. The U.S. had no intention of walking away from its shiny new Pacific outpost. But Carnegie's gesture stands as one of the most audacious checks ever, almost, written in protest. And while Carnegie was trying to buy peace, the American Revolution had once demanded blood, especially at a hill that wasn't quite a hill, in a battle that gave us one of the most electrifying lines in American lore. The Bunker Hill misfire. The battle wasn't at Bunker Hill. Not exactly. Most of the action took place on Breed's Hill, a nearby summit in Charlestown, Massachusetts. But history has a way of branding things incorrectly and then never looking back. What matters more than the coordinates is the cry that rose from the American ranks as British soldiers inched closer up the slope. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. It's one of the most dramatic lines in American military mythology. Gritty, desperate, and chillingly personal. The phrase was allegedly shouted by colonial officers to conserve ammo and ensure close-range accuracy against the better-armed British. It turns a battlefield into a staring contest. Don't shoot until you're so close you can count eyelashes. Whether those exact words were spoken is debatable. Some credit Colonel William Prescott. Others suggest it was borrowed from earlier European conflicts. But the effect was seared into American memory. Bunker Hill wasn't a victory. Technically, the British took the hill. But it was a statement that the colonies wouldn't go quietly, that they could fight and bleed and return the next day ready to do it again. And when the nation bled again, nearly a century later in the Civil War, the most sacred halls of government were transformed into something far more intimate and grim. The Capitol as a Civil War hospital, marble floors, ornate columns, echoing chambers where laws were shaped. In the early 1860s, the U.S. Capitol building wasn't just the heart of American democracy. It was also a hospital. The Civil War brought the conflict home in ways no one had expected. Washington, D.C., teetered between bureaucratic center and battlefield triage. As casualties poured in from nearby fronts, hospitals overflowed. Churches, schools, and even private homes were converted into makeshift medical stations. But few images strike as hard as the Capitol itself, a place designed for debate, now echoing with the moans of the wounded. Cots lined the rotunda. hallways filled with injured soldiers. The smell of blood, ether, and desperation mingled beneath the dome. Walt Whitman, who served as a volunteer nurse during the war, described the Capitol Hospital as both majestic and tragic. Soldiers lay in rows beneath the frescoed ceiling of the rotunda, bleeding beneath scenes of American triumph and unity, as their own country ripped itself apart. It was a stark contrast. The nation's ideals enshrined above, its consequences lying just below, wrapped in bandages and silent agony. And in the midst of this pain, one woman stood out, not with a scalpel, but with a diploma that shattered barriers. Elizabeth Blackwell, doctor against all odds. In a time when women were expected to treat teacups, not tumors, Elizabeth Blackwell cracked open the doors of American medicine with sheer audacity. In 1849, she became the first American woman to earn a medical degree, a feat so shocking, some people thought it was a typo on the diploma. Born in England and raised in Cincinnati, Blackwell didn't pursue medicine because she had some lifelong dream of becoming a doctor. She was inspired, or provoked, by a dying friend who said she would have suffered less if she'd had a female physician. Challenge accepted. After applying to 29 medical schools and being roundly rejected by all, Geneva Medical College in New York accidentally said yes. They let the all-male student body vote on her admission. A prank vote, essentially. The men thought it was a joke. When she showed up, it stopped being funny. Blackwell endured taunts, ostracism, and lectures in Latin, which she taught herself to read. She graduated first in her class. Later, she opened a medical college for women and pioneered public health reform, all while wearing a corset. Elizabeth Blackwell didn't just get a degree, she built a legacy. And while she was dissecting barriers, the U.S. was dealing with a very different invasion, one that came from the trees. The Great Squirrel Invasion of the 1880s. Squirrels. Cute, furry. The kind of thing you toss a peanut to in the park. But in the 1880s, they came in hordes. A twitching, fluffy wave of chaos that swarmed across parts of the United States like some kind of acorn-fueled apocalypse. This wasn't just a bad nut season. Farmers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the Midwest reported armies of squirrels descending on crops, tens of thousands of the critters, devouring cornfields and orchards like miniature, tail-wagging locusts. In some places, locals swore the ground looked like it was moving. Witnesses described clouds of squirrels, pouring over fences, chewing through everything. No one's entirely sure why it happened. Some blame unusual weather patterns, others suspect a population boom followed by food shortages in the wild. Whatever the cause, the squirrels became pests of biblical proportion. The states declared open season. Bounties were placed on squirrel scalps. Hunting contests broke out, with towns racking up body counts in the thousands. It was brutal. It was absurd. It was effective. Eventually, the invasion faded. And while America was fending off furry insurgents in the forests, one of its presidents was quietly battling an internal threat of his own, a disease he tried very, very hard to keep secret. Grover Cleveland's secret surgery. Imagine this. The President of the United States disappears for 5 days in the summer of 1893. No public announcement, no press conference, just gone. The reason? Grover Cleveland had a tumor the size of a golf ball growing on the roof of his mouth, and he planned to have it removed on a yacht. The panic of 1893 had just hit, a major economic depression. The stock market was shaky. The public was panicking. Cleveland feared that news of his illness would cause even more chaos. So he boarded a friend's yacht, the Oneida, for what the press was told was a fishing trip. It was actually a floating operating room. A team of 6 hand-picked surgeons removed the tumor, along with part of his upper jaw and 5 teeth, while sailing down the East River. The entire operation took about 90 minutes. The surgeons used mirrors, silence, and a boat that hopefully wouldn't rock too much. Miraculously, it worked. They fitted Cleveland with a rubber prosthetic so he could continue speaking normally. The secret held for a while. It wasn't until years later that the truth came out. Cleveland had steered the ship of state, literally, while undergoing life-saving surgery on the water. A presidential poker face, if there ever was one. And speaking of unlikely heroes, let's fly back to World War I, where America's most trusted messengers didn't walk or talk. They cooed. Pigeons of war, the feathered heroes of WUM. They don't wear medals. They don't give speeches. But in World War I, some of the United States' most vital battlefield messengers had wings and an instinct for home. The U.S. Army Signal Corps trained over 600 pigeons to carry crucial messages across enemy lines. And yes, some became full-blown war heroes. These weren't your average park pigeons. They were military specialists trained to fly through smoke, gunfire, and open skies filled with lead. Pigeons had one job: get the message home. When radios were unreliable and wires were cut, these birds were often the last hope. They traveled at 50, 60 miles per hour and could fly hundreds of miles to deliver a tiny scrolled message strapped to their leg. One pigeon, Cher Ami, saved the lives of nearly 200 American soldiers from the Lost Battalion during the Battle of the Argonne. Shot through the breast and blinded in one eye, she still managed to deliver a message that stopped friendly fire. The Army awarded her the Croix de Guerre, and after her death, she was stuffed and put on display at the Smithsonian. In a war defined by trench rot and machine guns, it was a 1-pound bird that outflew death. But not all American legends rode on wings. Some floated, some flailed, and one refused to sink. The unsinkable Molly Brown. Her real name was Margaret Tobin Brown, but history remembers her as the unsinkable Molly Brown, a socialite, philanthropist, and Titanic survivor whose life was anything but genteel. Born to Irish immigrants in Missouri, she struck it rich through marriage to a mining magnate. But Molly wasn't interested in just sipping tea and collecting pearls. She funded education, fought for labor rights, and ran for U.S. Senate before women could even vote. But her legend was forged on a cold night in April 1912, when the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg. As chaos broke out, Brown was placed aboard lifeboat number 6, but she didn't just sit there. She grabbed an oar, urged the crew to go back for more survivors, argued with a frightened officer, took control. When she was rescued by the Carpathia, she didn't collapse into aristocratic relief. She organized aid for fellow survivors, even pressing the captain to make a detour to help others. The press dubbed her the unsinkable Molly Brown, and she leaned into the fame, using it as fuel for activism. Her survival wasn't luck. It was grit, muscle, and sheer refusal to drown. And while her name became immortal, a very different kind of public panic would later sweep across the U.S. One not of sinking ships, but of flu shots, the Great Swine Flu Scare of 1976. It started with one soldier, Private David Lewis at Fort Dix, New Jersey, dropped dead after a bout of what seemed like regular flu. But the virus was swine flu, a strain eerily similar to the one that caused the 1918 pandemic. The government panicked. This could be the next great plague. So they launched one of the most aggressive vaccination campaigns in U.S. history. The goal: inoculate every single American. It was fast. It was public. It was televised. President Gerald Ford got his shot live on camera. So did anchormen and celebrities. Clinics popped up across the country. More than 45 million people were vaccinated in a matter of weeks. But then, nothing happened. No pandemic. No swine flu wave. What did happen were unexpected side effects. Reports began emerging of people developing Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder, after getting the vaccine. The program was halted. Investigations ensued. It was a medical moonshot, fast, bold, and messy. The government had gambled on prevention and lost in the court of public opinion. The 1976 swine flu scare became a cautionary tale about speed, science, and the politics of fear. And while it faded from memory, one man emerged from war with a far quieter kind of scar, The kind that comes with salt water, shrapnel, and a Purple Heart. John F. Kennedy and the wreck of PT-109, before the White House, before Camelot, before the eternal flame. John F. Kennedy was a skinny, sickly young naval officer commanding a plywood torpedo boat in the Pacific. In 1943, during a nighttime patrol in the Solomon Islands, Kennedy's PT-109 was rammed and sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer, killing 2 of his crew instantly. The boat sank. The survivors clung to debris in pitch-black waters, surrounded by the hum of sharks and the distant rumble of war. Kennedy, dragging an injured sailor by his life vest strap clenched in his teeth, swam for hours to reach a small island. Over the next 6 days, he led his men to safety, carving a rescue message into a coconut shell that was delivered by native islanders. That coconut shell? It sat on his Oval Office desk. For his actions, JFK received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal and a Purple Heart, making him the only U.S. president ever to receive one. The wound that earned it? A back injury worsened by heroism and forever aggravated by politics. He returned a war hero. But the song of heroism would come long before his time, and it would be born not in a jungle, but in the fire-lit sky over a crumbling fort in Baltimore. The anthem's original name, Defense of Fort McHenry. Long before Super Bowl halftime shows and tear-jerking flyovers, the Star-Spangled Banner was just a poem. A poem scribbled in the half-light of dawn by Francis Scott Key as British rockets exploded over Fort McHenry during the War of 1812. The title? Not exactly catchy. Defense of Fort McHenry, complete with that old-timey apostrophe, didn't exactly scream national hit, but it captured a moment frozen in cannon smoke. The sight of a massive American flag still waving after a night of bombardment. Key had boarded a British ship under a flag of truce to negotiate a prisoner release. Instead, he got stuck on board during the attack on Baltimore. From the deck, he watched all night. The bombardment lasted 25 hours. When morning finally came, the flag still flew. He wrote the poem in a rush, and it was quickly set to the tune of an old British drinking song, To Anacreon in Heaven. A few decades later, the lyrics were rebranded, polished, and adopted by military bands. It didn't become the official national anthem until 1931, nearly 117 years after that morning in Baltimore. But if the anthem began with rockets and poetry, American presidential imagery would soon leap into a new dimension, one where a founding son sat still for history's first presidential photograph. John Quincy Adams and the dawn of the presidential portrait. He wasn't the first president, but he was the first to be caught by the unblinking eye of a camera. In 1843, John Quincy Adams, the 6th president of the United States and the son of John Adams, posed for what would become the first known photographic image of an American president. He had already been out of office for over a decade by then, but Adams was still active, serving in the House of Representatives. He agreed to sit for a daguerreotype, the brand new photographic technology that was beginning to revolutionize the 19th century. The image is stiff, shadowed, and blurred at the edges. He looks tired, stern, a man burdened by history and impressed by none of it. His hair is wild, his suit severe. But in that image, a bridge was built, from the painted oil portraits of the Founding Fathers to the camera flashes of modern campaigns. It wasn't a campaign photo. It wasn't curated. It was raw mechanical memory. America's leadership rendered in silver and mercury vapor. And as the camera lens captured the face of a former president, the U.S. military was preparing for a new kind of warfare, one where even the ocean's depths were watched by whiskers. Sniffer dogs versus U-boats, Hoyt's unleashed experiment. In the swirling paranoia of World War II, the U.S. military tried everything. And yes, that includes dog detectives for submarines. It sounds like a rejected Saturday morning cartoon, but the Navy genuinely trained dogs to detect German U-boats. The idea was rooted in real science. Dogs have an extraordinary sense of smell, capable of detecting subtle chemical traces in the air. But seawater? That's another story. These dogs, mostly German Shepherds and Dobermans, were trained on coastal bases to sniff the scent of diesel fuel or human sweat from German crews surfacing or docking secretly. The concept was simple. Dogs on patrol boats or coastal outposts would alert when they smelled danger, like furry sonar. The results were mixed. Dogs did bark, they did alert, but the variables were unpredictable. Wind direction, salt spray, the overwhelming scent soup of the ocean. It turned out that detecting a submerged enemy from above water with your nose is a tall order, even for a trained canine. The program never led to widespread deployment. Still, it happened. It's one of those footnotes in military history that proves just how desperate and creative things got. But sometimes America's most iconic battles weren't fought with guns or paws. They were fought with a cargo of leaves. The Boston Tea Party, not about the tea. We call it a protest over tea. It's not. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 wasn't about caffeine or flavor or even tax rates. It was about monopoly. More specifically, the British East India Company, a corporate juggernaut that had just been given exclusive rights to sell tea in the American colonies, bypassing colonial merchants entirely. The Tea Act of 1773 wasn't a tax hike. It actually lowered the price of tea. But it cut American traders out of the equation, and that was the real offense. Colonists didn't want cheaper tea if it came with a side of corporate chokehold and royal overreach. So they disguised themselves as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor, and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, an act of economic defiance disguised as a nighttime prank. It wasn't universally praised. Some patriots thought it went too far. Others feared British retaliation, but it electrified the colonies. And the British response, the coercive acts, only made things worse. A soggy protest had lit the fuse for revolution. But while that storm stirred up rebellion, another kind of storm, very literal, very deadly, was building off the Atlantic coast nearly 165 years later. The Great New England Hurricane of 1938. It struck without warning. In an age before Doppler radar and hourly forecasts, the Great New England Hurricane of 1938 roared ashore with catastrophic force on September 21st, leveling entire towns and killing over 600 people. It began as a tropical storm near the coast of Africa, but picked up terrifying speed across the Atlantic. Weather stations failed to track its acceleration. Forecasts were vague. When it made landfall in Long Island and slammed into Connecticut and Rhode Island, few were prepared. Wind gusts hit 186 miles per hour. Storm surges reached 17 feet. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Trains were lifted off tracks. It wasn't just powerful, it was fast. The storm raced northward at 60 miles per hour, carving a 100-mile-wide path of destruction through the heart of New England. Entire beach communities were obliterated. In Providence, Rhode Island, downtown streets became rivers. Over 8,000 homes were destroyed. Damage was estimated at over $300 million in 1938 dollars. Over $5 billion today. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in U.S. history. A reminder that even the oldest, most settled regions are not safe from nature's fury. And while buildings were ripped from their foundations, a future president would rise who didn't win a single vote. At least not from the people. Gerald Ford, the unelected president. No campaign trail. No primetime debates. No landslide victory. Gerald R. Ford became the 38th president of the United States without receiving a single electoral vote for president or vice president. A constitutional oddity born out of scandal and resignation. It all started with Spiro Agnew, Richard Nixon's original vice president, who resigned in 1973 amid a bribery investigation. Nixon, under the 25th Amendment, nominated Ford, then House Minority Leader, to replace him. Congress approved. Ford was in. Then came Watergate. Nixon's presidency crumbled under the weight of tapes, hush money, and resignations. On August 9, 1974, Nixon became the first and only U.S. president to resign. With no election, no fanfare, and no mandate, Gerald Ford took the oath. "Our long national nightmare is over," he said. And yet his presidency was anything but peaceful. Ford pardoned Nixon, a move that nearly destroyed his credibility. He battled inflation, faced assassination attempts, and bumbled on camera often enough to become a national punchline. But through it all, Ford carried himself with a Midwestern bluntness that made him oddly endearing. The ultimate accidental president, honest to a fault. And while Ford tried to steady a wounded nation, America had once been rocked by something far more unexpected. A full-on whiskey-fueled brawl at its most disciplined institution. The Great Eggnog Riot of 1826. Yes, it really happened. On Christmas Eve, 1826, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point erupted into chaos over eggnog. The cadets wanted holiday cheer, the kind with booze in it. But the Academy, in full Grinch mode, had banned alcohol. So naturally, the future leaders of America smuggled in whiskey, gallons of it. The nog was mixed. The party began. And soon the barracks at West Point turned into a scene that sounds more Animal House than Arlington. Fights broke out. Furniture was smashed. Doors kicked in. Windows shattered. One cadet tried to shoot a superior officer. Others climbed out windows and brawled on the lawn. The mess hall turned into a temporary battlefield. In the morning, the commandant, no doubt hung over by osmosis, surveyed the damage and launched a crackdown. Over 70 cadets were implicated, and 19 were court-martialed. Among the partiers, a young man named Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy. He was let off with a warning. The Eggnog Riot remains one of the most surreal disciplinary disasters in U.S. military history. And while it took place on Earth, the next American milestone would blast straight into the cosmos. Alan Shepard, first American in space. Before Armstrong's one small step, before orbit and moon rocks and space shuttles, there was Alan Shepard, the first American to leave Earth. On May 5, 1961, Shepard climbed into a tiny Mercury capsule dubbed Freedom 7, strapped to a Redstone rocket, and rocketed 116 miles into the sky. The whole flight lasted just 15 minutes. He didn't orbit the Earth. He didn't walk in zero gravity. But in that quarter hour, Shepard did something no American had ever done. He pierced the heavens. It was a direct answer to Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet cosmonaut who had beaten the U.S. into space just weeks earlier. The Cold War was raging, and space had become the new battlefield. Shepard's flight was short, but it proved the U.S. could play the game. Years later, Shepard would return to space, this time on Apollo 14, and become the fifth man to walk on the moon. He even smuggled a golf club and hit 2 balls across the lunar surface. The second flew for miles. From cadet riots to cosmic swings, American history keeps swinging between absurdity and awe. And speaking of big money, let's talk about a time when a single bill could buy you a mansion, a yacht, and probably an election. The $10,000 bill. Pocket change for titans. Once upon a time, American currency had more zeros than a Bond villain's bank account. In the early 20th century, the U.S. government printed bills in denominations that make today's $100 note look like lunch money. Among them, the mythic $10,000 bill. This high roller note wasn't for everyday use. You didn't stuff it into a wallet or break it at the grocery store. It was used strictly for transactions between Federal Reserve banks. Most Americans never saw one in the wild, but it was very real. The face on the bill? Salmon P. Chase, Treasury Secretary under Lincoln, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the guy who helped create the modern national banking system. Fitting, really, that the man who helped organize America's money ended up on the most expensive slice of it. Today, The $10,000 bill is a collector's dream. Fewer than 350 are known to exist, and if one hits the auction block, it can fetch well over its face value. Way over. The U.S. has since phased out all large denomination bills, mostly to combat money laundering. But once, in a land of vaults and briefcases and untraceable transactions, paper money was printed with so many zeros it needed its own mythos. And speaking of legends and loot, let's sail back to the days when colonial coasts weren't just dotted with merchant ships. They were stalked by a different kind of sailor. The golden age of piracy and American colonial trade. You hear pirate, and your brain cues up parrots and peg legs. But in the late 1600s and early 1700s, piracy was less theme park and more economic warfare, and it hit American colonial trade right in the treasure chest. The golden age of piracy wasn't golden for merchants. Pirates like Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Anne Bonny prowled the Atlantic, targeting ships from Boston, Charleston, and New York. They raided sloops and schooners, capturing sugar, rum, tobacco, and gold, and sometimes entire ships. Colonial ports became pirate playgrounds. Nassau, in the Bahamas, was practically a pirate republic. Some American towns benefited from the black market surge, trading with pirates under the table. Others suffered, with commerce disrupted and ships vanishing like mist. The British Navy eventually cracked down, hanging pirates by the dozens and ending the era with gallows. Not glory, but the cultural imprint stuck. The Jolly Roger, the outlaw sailor, the buried treasure, all born from an era that made colonial merchants sleep with one eye open. And yet, while pirates owned the seas, the U.S. would later try conquering deserts, with a bizarre cavalry experiment involving an animal better suited for pyramids than prairies, the camel corps of the American Southwest. In the 1850s, the U.S. Army stared down the brutal heat of the Southwest and thought, what if camels? Congress surprisingly agreed. Thus was born the U.S. Camel Corps, an experimental military unit that swapped horses for humpbacks. Imported from Egypt and the Middle East, dozens of camels arrived in Texas in 1856. They were managed by Arab and Turkish handlers and tested in brutal terrain. The results? Astonishing. Camels could carry twice the load of mules, travel for days without water, spook enemies, conquer desert like four-legged tanks. But there was a problem. The Army hated them. Soldiers found the camels hard to control. They spat, they screamed, they didn't play nice with horses. Logistics were a nightmare. When the Civil War broke out, funding dried up. The experiment was abandoned. Many camels were sold off. Others escaped. For decades afterward, wild camels were spotted roaming the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, ghostly remnants of one of the U.S. military's strangest ideas. And while camels faded into myth, another president was gearing up for a journey no commander-in-chief had ever dared, crossing the Atlantic while still in office. Woodrow Wilson crosses the Atlantic. It was a first, and it came at the worst possible time. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson became the first sitting U.S. president to cross the Atlantic Ocean, setting sail aboard the George Washington for the Paris Peace Conference. The Great War had ended, and the victors were carving up the globe. Wilson wanted to be there, to sculpt peace, sell his League of Nations, and usher in a new world order. The optics were historic. The President of the United States, once anchored to domestic soil, now stepped onto foreign turf to play global architect. But this voyage was more than symbolic. It also marked the beginning of America's complex love-hate affair with global leadership. Wilson didn't just cross the ocean. He crossed a boundary in presidential precedent. No longer just commander-in-chief, he was now globetrotter-in-chief. The trip, however, took its toll. Physically exhausted, politically battered, Wilson returned home to fierce opposition. Congress would eventually reject the League of Nations, and Wilson, weakened and increasingly isolated, suffered a stroke that left him incapacitated for the final years of his term. Still, his Atlantic crossing redefined what the presidency could look like: mobile, international, and uncomfortably exposed to the winds of global diplomacy. And speaking of winds, let's talk about the blizzard that froze the eastern seaboard and buried cities in white silence. The Great Blizzard of 1888. It came like a ghost in the night, silent, swift, and suffocating. On March 11, 1888, the Great Blizzard slammed the East Coast with hurricane-force winds and snowdrifts higher than telegraph poles. New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, all brought to their knees by nature's frozen wrath. Snow fell at a rate of 5 inches per hour. Trains froze on the tracks. Telegraph lines snapped like twigs. In New York, people tunneled through snowbanks to escape their homes. Entire buildings were buried up to the second story. The city's elevated trains ground to a halt, and horse-drawn carriages became death traps. Over 400 people died across the region. The storm was so fierce, it pushed New York into finally moving its power and telegraph lines underground. It was, in many ways, the storm that dragged the 19th century into modern infrastructure. The blizzard also triggered a rethinking of emergency planning. Mail was delayed. Fire brigades couldn't respond. Morgues overflowed. The idea of an interconnected, vulnerable cityscape had been exposed, and the only solution was to dig deeper and build smarter. But while nature was busy rewriting the rule book on urban survival, one woman in California was quietly rewriting the rules of politics. Marietta Stowe, the forgotten VP candidate. Long before Geraldine Ferraro or Kamala Harris ever made campaign history, there was Marietta Stowe, a suffragist, reformer, and all-around electoral firebrand who became the first American woman to run for vice president. The year was 1884. The platform? Equality and straight-up disruption. Stowe wasn't part of a mainstream party. She ran under the banner of the Equal Rights Party, a short-lived but audacious attempt to inject women into the highest levels of political discourse. Her presidential running mate? Belva Lockwood, a lawyer who had already argued cases before the Supreme Court. Together, they ran on a radical platform: women's suffrage, civil rights, equal pay, and government reform. It was political heresy at a time when women couldn't even vote, let alone legislate. But Stowe wasn't interested in waiting. She put her name on the ballot anyway. They didn't win. They didn't even come close. But they didn't have to. The campaign was a statement, a flare shot into the sky saying that women weren't just campaign ornaments. They could lead. And just a century later, one of the weirdest things ever launched into the stratosphere wouldn't be a candidate. It would be a bathtub toy. The rubber ducky in space. You can't make this stuff up. In 1992, the United States launched a rubber ducky into space. No, it wasn't some rogue astronaut's bath time mascot. It was science. Specifically, an experiment aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour, part of mission STS-47, which included payloads from all over the world. Somewhere among the modules, satellites, and high-tech instruments floated a little yellow duck. The goal? Demonstrate fluid dynamics in microgravity. The rubber ducky and other floating objects helped researchers visually observe how liquids behave without gravity to pull them down. In space, the duck didn't just float. It drifted lazily through zero-G, a surreal image of childhood whimsy turned scientific tool. It's one of the most delightfully absurd moments in NASA's long history of dead serious experimentation. A symbol that, when it comes to exploring the cosmos, nothing is too strange if it helps explain the physics of the universe. Not even a tub toy bobbing through the final frontier. And while NASA was experimenting with ducks in orbit, the White House once had a much stranger critter roaming the halls. One with claws, teeth, and a habit of stealing the spotlight. Calvin Coolidge's pet raccoon. Meet Rebecca. She had fur, attitude, and free reign over the White House during the Coolidge administration. Originally sent to be Thanksgiving dinner, yes, really, the The raccoon arrived as a gift from a Mississippi supporter. But instead of ending up on a platter, she became a pet. President Calvin Coolidge and First Lady Grace Coolidge fell in love with her. Rebecca was given a collar engraved with her name and often went on walks with the president, attended public events, and sometimes climbed curtains during formal dinners. At night, she'd curl up in the bathtub or steal shiny things from staffers' pockets. Coolidge's fondness for unusual pets didn't stop there. He also had a wallaby, a pygmy hippo, and a bobcat named Smokey. But Rebecca stole the show. She was a living contradiction. A wild animal treated like royalty in the most powerful house in America. It was pure Americana, a reminder that presidents aren't always polished statesmen. Sometimes they're just dudes with raccoons on their shoulders. And if you think that's weird, buckle up. Because once upon a time, the U.S. military tried to fight hurricanes with bombs. Project Storm Fury, bombing the weather. It sounds like a rejected Bond villain plot. But in the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. government actually tried to bomb hurricanes. Not to destroy them outright, but to weaken them. The effort was known as Project Storm Fury, and it was the official attempt to play weather god. The theory was deceptively simple. Hurricanes feed on warm air around their eye. By seeding the storm with silver iodide, launched from aircraft, or yes, exploding charges, scientists hoped to disrupt the eye wall and reduce the storm's intensity. Like throwing a wrench into a cosmic blender, they tried it on Hurricane Beulah, Hurricane Debbie, and a few others. Results were inconclusive. Sometimes the storms weakened, but often they didn't. And it turned out that the natural behavior of hurricanes is wildly unpredictable, making it almost impossible to measure whether the bomb seeding did anything at all. Eventually, Storm Fury was shelved. Too risky, too vague, too expensive. Today, it stands as a fascinating relic of Cold War-era ambition, when we thought nuking a cyclone might just be a reasonable plan. And while scientists tried to tweak the weather, another piece of the American puzzle remained frustratingly unsolvable. A colony that disappeared without a trace. The lost colony of Roanoke. It's one of America's oldest and creepiest mysteries. The tale of a vanished colony, a cryptic word carved into wood, and centuries of speculation. In 1587, more than 100 English settlers landed on Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina. They built homes, they planted crops, and then they disappeared. When Governor John White, who had returned to England for supplies, finally made it back in 1590, the entire colony was gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle. Just one clue, the word Croatoan, carved into a post. Historians have theories. Maybe they integrated with local Native American tribes. Maybe they were killed. Maybe they tried to sail home and failed. But no definitive evidence has ever been found. No graves, no wrecks, no diaries left behind. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a ghost story written into the foundation of American history. The first English child born in the New World, Virginia Dare, was part of that colony. Her fate? Unknown, which makes her, arguably, America's first missing person. Roanoke's legend has endured because it's the kind of mystery history can't solve. A blank page at the very start of the American chapter. But while that colony vanished quietly, another American story exploded, literally, in a catastrophe of steel and smoke. The Great Train Wreck of 1918, July 9th, 1918. It was early morning in Nashville, Tennessee, and two trains, packed with passengers and running behind schedule, sped toward each other on a single track. One was a local train, the other an express. Signals were missed, warnings ignored, and just outside the city in a wooded area called Dutchman's Curve, disaster struck. The collision was cataclysmic. Wooden cars telescoped into each other. Steel twisted like wire. Fires broke out. Bodies were flung into trees. Over 100 people were killed instantly, and more than 170 injured, making it the deadliest train accident in U.S. history. Most of the passengers were African-American laborers heading to work at a gunpowder plant. Their names, rarely memorialized, tell a darker tale about who rode in the most dangerous cars and who bore the brunt of industrial America's mistakes. The wreck led to reforms in signaling systems, better communication protocols, and eventually tougher train car designs. But for those on board, the change came too late. The only thing faster than the express train that day was the speed at which everything went wrong. And while the wreck was measured in tons and tragedy, another president was quietly dealing with a different kind of measurement, one that made waves in porcelain. William Howard Taft and the bathtub of legend. He was large, really large. William Howard Taft, America's 27th president, tipped the scales at over 300 pounds. But the most enduring tale of his presidency isn't about trust-busting or diplomacy. It's about plumbing. According to the legend, Taft once got stuck in a White House bathtub. Whether or not that's literally true is still debated. But what is confirmed is that after the incident, a custom-made, extra-wide bathtub was installed just for him. It was 7 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, and could fit 4 grown men. Yes, it was tested. The tub became a symbol of Taft's girth, and unfairly, his legacy. Taft was a brilliant legal mind, the only person to ever serve as both U.S. President and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But in the public imagination, he'll always be the guy with the reinforced bathtub. It's a reminder of how absurdity can anchor even the most accomplished careers. And speaking of bizarre tactics, next we dive into another Cold War curiosity, one that flippered its way into classified operations. SEAL Team. Real? Trained SEALs and Cold War mine hunting. In the surreal arms race of Cold War innovation, nothing was too strange to try, not even weaponizing sea lions. The U.S. Navy, always on the lookout for unorthodox tactics, began training SEALs and sea lions to detect underwater mines and spot enemy divers. These weren't circus performers with cute flippers. They were part of the Navy Marine Mammal Program, a classified effort to turn intelligent marine animals into tools of underwater surveillance. SEALs, with their acute underwater vision and agility, were ideal for detecting hidden dangers in murky depths where humans and machines often failed. Trained with whistles, fish, and specialized signals, these marine mammals could locate objects and report back using harnesses with mounted cameras or markers. Some were even trained to attach devices to suspicious objects or tag enemy swimmers. The program still technically exists today, though now it's mostly the dolphins doing the heavy lifting. But the SEAL squads of the Cold War were proof of just how seriously the U.S. took the possibility of an enemy invasion from the sea, and how far they were willing to stretch the definition of special ops. But long before sea lions scanned for Soviet threats, American riders once raced across the untamed frontier on horseback, rewriting what express delivery meant. The Pony Express, 18 months of legend. No mail trucks, no phones, no planes, just grit, saddles, and speed. The Pony Express galloped into American legend in 1860, slashing the time it took to deliver messages between Missouri and California from weeks to just 10 days. It was a logistical marvel for its time. A relay system of riders, horses, and remote way stations stretching nearly 2,000 miles through rugged terrain. Riders rode day and night, braving blizzards, bandits, and hostile territory. Each carried a mochila, a special saddlebag with 4 locked compartments, filled with government dispatches, newspapers, and private letters. The service was brutally fast, dangerously difficult, and wildly romanticized. Riders had to be light, under 125 pounds, fearless and fast. The job came with a death wish disguised as a paycheck. But despite the myths, the Pony Express was short-lived, just 18 months. It ended in 1861, crushed by the completion of the transcontinental telegraph. Yet its legacy stuck. Today, it's an icon of American resolve and frontier tenacity, a wild gallop etched into the national psyche. And if the Old West had its galloping heroes, New York City in the 1850s had its own battle. Not against bandits, but against the unbearable stench of its own making. The Great Stink of 1858. It was the summer of stink. In 1858, New York City found itself enveloped in a choking miasma of raw sewage, rotting trash, and industrial runoff. The East River had turned into a bubbling cesspool. The city's sewers were overwhelmed. And the smell? Legend has it, it could knock out a horse. This wasn't just a matter of discomfort. It was a public health crisis. Diseases like cholera and typhoid spread like wildfire. Residents covered their faces with handkerchiefs soaked in cologne. The rich fled the city. The poor suffered in it. Newspapers dubbed it the Great Stink, borrowing the name from a similar incident in London. The problem was simple. Waste disposal hadn't caught up with population growth. Toilets emptied into the streets emptied into rivers, and everything festered in the summer heat. Reformers demanded action. Engineers scrambled to overhaul the sewer system, eventually modeling it after London's. The Great Stink was a turning point, a nauseating wake-up call that forced cities to modernize their sanitation systems. Because in the 19th century, nothing made the need for infrastructure clearer than a city marinating in its own filth. And while the White House never smelled that bad, one president kept pets that didn't help the olfactory situation, with snouts, scales, and snapping jaws. Herbert Hoover's White House alligators. It sounds like a Florida headline gone rogue, but it's true. President Herbert Hoover kept 2 alligators at the White House. No, not in tanks, not in cages, just wandering the grounds. The 31st president, often unfairly remembered only for the Great Depression, had a soft spot for unconventional pets. And his gators, gifts from a political ally in the South, were the apex predators of presidential oddity. The gators weren't permanent residents, but they made memorable appearances. Hoover would occasionally show them off to guests, letting them roam the lawn or lurk near the fountain like scaly security guards. They reportedly freaked out more than one unsuspecting diplomat strolling through the gardens. While it's unclear how long the gators stayed, they cemented Hoover's place in the pantheon of strange White House pet owners, right alongside Coolidge's raccoon and Teddy Roosevelt's badger. It's one of those details that makes you squint at history and mutter, "Wait, what?" But if Hoover's gators were strange, they pale in comparison to a Cold War-era idea that involved nuking a canal into the earth like it was Play-Doh. Nuking a canal, Project Plowshare. Let's be clear. The U.S. government once seriously considered using nuclear bombs to dig a bigger, better Panama Canal. In the 1960s, under a program called Project Plowshare, scientists proposed detonating atomic devices to blast a sea-level canal through Central America, a shortcut for global shipping made by radioactive excavation. The plan sounded like mad genius on paper. Instead of years of digging, just drop a few megatons and boom, canal. Fast, cheap, efficient, but also apocalyptic. The environmental impact alone would have been catastrophic. Fallout clouds, seismic shock waves, irradiated wildlife. Not to mention the minor issue of detonating thermonuclear weapons near populated areas. Test runs were done in Nevada to simulate the technique, and while they did make holes in the ground, they also contaminated everything nearby and left behind moonscapes of radioactive dust. Unsurprisingly, public opinion soured. The plan was shelved. Today, Project Plowshare remains a symbol of Cold War overconfidence, when nuclear solutions were seen as cure-alls, no matter how absurd. A time when the answer to "how do we dig a ditch?" was try a hydrogen bomb. And speaking of high-stakes engineering gambles, one American pilot once flew across the Atlantic in a plane so stripped down it didn't even have a front windshield. The Spirit of St. Louis had no front windshield. When Charles Lindbergh climbed into the Spirit of St. Louis in 1927, he wasn't just risking his life. He was trusting an aircraft designed to prioritize fuel over everything, including visibility. His legendary solo transatlantic flight was made in a plane with no front windshield. Why? Weight. To carry enough fuel for the non-stop flight from New York to Paris, Lindbergh's team cut every non-essential feature. Instead of a windshield, the front of the aircraft was filled with fuel tanks. Lindbergh had to use a periscope and side windows to see where he was going, essentially flying blind over thousands of miles of ocean. The result was one of the most dangerous and iconic flights in history. 33 and a half hours. No radio, no co-pilot, no Jeep, just Lindbergh, his instincts, and a glorified gas tank with wings. The Spirit of St. Louis now sits in the Smithsonian, frozen in time as a symbol of innovation, insanity, and bravery. It's proof that sometimes history is made not by having a clear view ahead, but by having the guts to take off anyway. And if aviation is risky, fire is worse, especially when it rips through a city and turns wood, brick, and steel into glowing rubble. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871. It started on a Sunday night, October the 8th, 1871, and by Tuesday, a third of Chicago was gone. The Great Chicago Fire consumed over 17,000 buildings, left 100,000 people homeless, and killed nearly 300. It's one of the most famous urban infernos in American history, remembered not just for its destruction, but for how it sparked the rebirth of a modern metropolis. The fire reportedly began in a barn owned by the O'Leary family. Legend and lazy 19th century journalism blamed it on Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern. The truth? Still unknown. What is known? The city was bone dry after months of drought. Its buildings were mostly wood, and winds whipped the flames into a firestorm. The blaze leapt rivers, incinerated sidewalks, and reduced downtown Chicago to smoldering ruins. Yet out of the ashes came one of the greatest rebuilding projects in American history. Architects like Louis Sullivan and Daniel Burnham turned Chicago into a playground of steel and stone. Skyscrapers rose, innovation flourished. The city didn't just survive, it reinvented urban America. But while the Windy City rose from the ashes, another U.S. president once found himself under fire. Not from historians or politicians, but from the local police. Franklin Pierce, President Drunk and Horse-Hit and Runner. Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, had one of the most tragic and chaotic 10 years in office. But one of the strangest footnotes in his biography came after the White House in 1853, when he was allegedly arrested for accidentally running over an old woman with his horse in Washington, D.C. Yes, really. Pierce had a reputation for hard drinking, even while in office. Accounts vary, but the story goes that he was riding through town, perhaps a bit too swiftly, perhaps a bit too sauced, when he struck a pedestrian. The woman survived, and the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. But the scandal stuck. D.C. gossip columns feasted. It was a bizarre, unpresidential moment for a man already burdened by grief and poor decisions. Pierce's administration is often blamed for laying the groundwork for the Civil War. But that moment in the street showed just how far his personal life had unraveled. Still, if a drunken horse incident is scandalous, what do you call trying to make submarines out of glass? The see-through submarine. Some ideas are so wild they almost sound genius, until you remember physics. During the Cold War, U.S. engineers once flirted with building a submarine using transparent materials. The goal? Create a see-through sub that would be difficult to detect with sonar and allow internal monitoring of aquatic conditions in real time. Imagine a stealth tank made of glass, lurking underwater like an invisible shark. To be clear, this wasn't about using actual window glass, but specialized acrylics and plastics. Lightweight, potentially radar-absorbent, and transparent. Prototypes were discussed. Small models were built, but the technical hurdles were enormous. Pressure at depth would shatter most transparent materials. Maintenance was a nightmare. Visibility didn't help when you were hundreds of feet below the surface and still had to be opaque to the enemy. Eventually, the concept was shelved, joining the ranks of other Cold War dreams that flirted with science fiction. But the ambition? Purely American, invisible, underwater, and a little ridiculous. And speaking of impossible ambition, the next figure didn't just win a peace prize. He won a war without fighting it, proving that sometimes the sharpest weapon is a handshake. Theodore Roosevelt and the Peace Prize power play. Teddy Roosevelt. The man wore spectacles and carried a big stick. But in 1906, he swapped his Rough Rider bravado for diplomacy, and it paid off. That year, Roosevelt became the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize, not for a rousing battlefield victory or a grand speech, but for brokering peace in one of the most explosive conflicts of the era, the Russo-Japanese War. The war had been raging since 1904, a brutal clash between two imperial powers over territory in East Asia. Japan shocked the world with its military prowess, but both sides were bleeding resources. Roosevelt stepped in, hosting negotiations at a tranquil New Hampshire resort. He didn't just smooth egos, he wielded leverage, incentives, and subtle threats to coax both sides to the table. The result was the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the war and stunned the global stage. Roosevelt didn't just make peace, he announced America's arrival as a global broker, someone who could end fights just as easily as he could start them. The Peace Prize wasn't just a medal, it was validation that the U.S. wasn't just a rough-and-tumble frontier nation anymore. It could think, negotiate, and lead on the world stage. And yet, while Roosevelt was bringing peace abroad, back home, Americans were running a secret, silent war of their own. One not against nations, but against slavery. The Underground Railroad, not actually underground. No tracks, no trains, just courage, code words, and candlelit windows. The Underground Railroad was America's most famous misnomer. Not a railroad at all, but a clandestine network of routes, safe houses, and fearless conductors who helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Operating primarily in the early to mid-1800s, the railroad stretched from southern plantations to northern states and Canada. Passengers were fugitives. Stations were homes and churches. Conductors were ordinary people who risked arrest, fines, and violence to help others flee the chains of bondage. The system had no central leadership. It was a decentralized resistance, stitched together by trust and bravery. Harriet Tubman, one of its most legendary figures, made multiple trips into the South, rescuing over 70 enslaved people herself, armed with nothing but grit and a revolver. It was illegal. It was dangerous. And it was one of the most profound acts of civil disobedience in American history. A quiet revolution conducted under the noses of slave catchers and Southern militias. The Underground Railroad wasn't about tracks. It was about transformation, turning fear into movement and movement into freedom. But fast forward a century, and Americans were battling a very different kind of force. Winter itself. The Great Blizzard of 1977. Buffalo, New York, knows snow. But 1977 rewrote the definition of whiteout. That January, the city was buried under a once-in-a-century snowstorm that didn't just shut things down. It made the whole region look like a Siberian military base. It wasn't just snow falling from the sky. It was snow blown in from frozen Lake Erie. A freak combination of bitter cold, relentless wind, and previous snowfall turned the city into a wind tunnel of ice and misery. Visibility dropped to zero. Cars vanished under drifts. People walked out of their front doors into a wall of snow. At one point, entire streets became impassable. Emergency vehicles got stranded. Looting broke out in some areas. By the time it ended, 23 people were dead, hundreds were injured, and damages ran into the hundreds of millions. For Buffalo, it wasn't just a blizzard. It was a survival test. The storm forced changes in infrastructure, emergency protocols, and even snow removal technology. Because when nature decides to throw a tantrum, even a snow-hardened city like Buffalo can blink. And from blizzards on Earth, we turn to bleeding, grazing lawnmowers. A wartime president's delightfully bizarre solution to groundskeeping at the White House. Woodrow Wilson's White House sheep. Picture the White House lawn. Perfectly manicured, symmetrical, green. Now picture a flock of sheep munching their way across it like it's a petting zoo on Pennsylvania Avenue. During World War I, President Woodrow Wilson, ever the progressive pragmatist, deployed woolly lawnmowers to cut costs and support the war effort. The idea was both practical and symbolic. By replacing gas-powered mowing with a herd of sheep, the White House could trim expenses and free up manpower. Even better, the wool was sheared and auctioned off to raise money for the Red Cross. It was a PR masterstroke. Pastoral patriotism meets wartime thrift. There were around 18 sheep, including a prize ram named Old Ike, who had a bad temper and a taste for chewing tobacco. The herd became minor celebrities, attracting tourists and press. They were eventually removed after the war ended, but their legacy lingers as one of the most unusual war efforts ever to graze the executive lawn. And while Wilson was hosting hooved guests, another idea was quietly fermenting in diplomatic back rooms. An American dream of empire that nearly included its closest tropical neighbor. The U.S. considered buying Cuba. In the 19th century, the United States wanted Cuba badly. For decades, American leaders eyed the Spanish colony as the crown jewel of expansion. It was close. It was profitable. And most importantly, it was still under foreign control, which irritated manifest destiny types to no end. President James Polk even offered Spain $100 million for the island in 1848. Spain responded with a diplomatic version of not for sale. That didn't stop later attempts. The Ostend Manifesto of 1854, essentially a diplomatic leak, revealed U.S. plans to buy or take Cuba by force if Spain refused. It was an aggressive, imperialist play that horrified Northern abolitionists, who saw it as a move to expand slavery. The plan fizzled, but the obsession didn't. Fast forward to 1898, and the Spanish-American War finally pried Cuba away, not into U.S. hands as a state, but into a tangled protectorate status under the Platt Amendment. America didn't buy Cuba, but it certainly got involved in its future, wielding influence long after Spain left the scene. And speaking of conflict born at home, let's talk about a moment when fashion, identity, and wartime paranoia collided violently in the streets of Los Angeles. The Zoot Suit riots of 1943. In the summer of 1943, Los Angeles turned into a battlefield. Not because of bombs or foreign invaders, but because of fabric, specifically Zoot Suits. Flamboyant, oversized outfits worn by many young Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Filipino Americans. The suits became lightning rods for racial tension, wartime nationalism, and xenophobic rage. Servicemen stationed in Southern California saw Zoot Suits as unpatriotic, too flashy, too extravagant, especially during a time of fabric rationing. But for many young Latinos, the suits weren't about rebellion. They were a cultural statement, bold, proud, and rooted in jazz and Chicano identity. That didn't matter. Tensions exploded in June when white sailors roamed downtown L.A., attacking anyone in a Zoot Suit. The violence spread for days. Police often arrested the victims instead of the attackers. The city declared a ban on Zoot Suits, but not on the mobs. The riots exposed deep fractures about race, assimilation, and who got to define American patriotism during war. It wasn't just a clothing clash. It was a street-level referendum on inclusion, expression, and the limits of conformity. And while the Navy went after suits, the CIA would soon target something stranger, turning cats into Cold War spies. Project Acoustic Kitty, the spy cat that never came back. You've heard of James Bond. Now meet Agent Whiskers. During the Cold War, the CIA launched one of its strangest projects ever, Acoustic Kitty, an attempt to turn a living cat into a four-legged surveillance device. The idea was simple in theory and utterly bonkers in practice. Engineers surgically implanted a microphone into the cat's ear canal, a battery near the base of its skull, and an antenna in its tail. The plan? Release the cat near Soviet embassies and eavesdrop on sensitive conversations as it innocently wandered past foreign agents. Spoiler: it didn't work. In its first field test, the CIA released the feline near a target in D.C. Within minutes, the poor thing ran into traffic and was hit by a taxi. Decades later, the story was declassified and instantly entered the Hall of Fame for failed espionage. Not because of its ambition, but because it asked the question, what if we turned a house pet into a Cold War cyborg? The answer? Cats don't care about geopolitics. Meanwhile, back in the White House, one president gave his pet the kind of political clout most humans never get. Laddie Boy, cabinet dog in chief. Warren G. Harding, the 29th president, may be remembered for scandals and sudden death, but his dog, Laddie Boy, was a full-blown D.C. celebrity. An Airedale Terrier with personality and press coverage, Laddie Boy had his own hand-carved chair at cabinet meetings. And yes, he used it. Harding adored him. Laddie Boy attended public events, posed for portraits, and even signed letters with a paw print. He had a personal press agent. The dog was gifted from a famous breeder and quickly became more beloved than the president himself. Newspapers regularly ran Laddie Boy updates, and children mailed him fan letters. After Harding's death, 19,000 bronze pennies were donated by school children to create a statue of the dog. It was the first time a presidential pet was truly part of the administration's public persona, setting the stage for future four-legged photo ops and campaign trail cameos. But not even Laddie Boy's charm could outshine the next disaster. A watery monster that devoured entire states, the Great Flood of 1927. It began with rain, relentless, biblical, unyielding. By the spring of 1927, the Mississippi River swelled beyond its banks, breaking levees and swallowing towns from Illinois to Louisiana. It became one of the most devastating floods in U.S. history, submerging over 27,000 square miles and displacing nearly 1 million people. The floodwaters moved like liquid gravity, slow, inescapable, and crushing. In some places, the water was 30 feet deep. Cities disappeared. Entire regions became inland seas. Refugees crammed onto levees, rooftops, and any dry scrap of land they could find. The government response was chaotic. The National Guard was deployed. Relief camps were set up, segregated and underfunded. Black sharecroppers in particular were forced to work on levee repair at gunpoint, triggering widespread outrage and contributing to the Great Migration as thousands fled the South forever. Politically, the disaster shaped futures. A young Herbert Hoover, in charge of flood relief, used his role to launch a presidential bid. But the storm also revealed deep racial and economic divides, the fault lines hidden beneath the waters. The Mississippi eventually receded. The trauma didn't. And while the country dried out, another American was quietly rewriting the map. One latitude, one longitude at a time. Robert Gray, first American around the world. Before steam engines, before telegraphs, before the very idea of a United States had solidified, Robert Gray was sailing into the unknown. In 1790, aboard the ship Columbia Rediviva, Gray became the first American to circumnavigate the globe. Not as a tourist, but as a merchant, a risk-taker, and an unintentional cartographer of empire. Gray's voyage began with a commercial goal: trade along the Pacific Northwest coast, gather valuable sea otter pelts, and then sell them in China for massive profit. From there, he'd take Chinese goods back to Boston, completing the first American globe hop, not fueled by politics, but by the oldest motivation on Earth: profit. The trip took over 2 years. He navigated uncharted waters, survived treacherous conditions, and helped stake an American presence in the Pacific long before the U.S. had a navy worth mentioning. During his later voyages, Gray also discovered and named the Columbia River, a critical geographic claim that would one day help America justify westward expansion into Oregon. Robert Gray didn't do it for the glory, but he ended up with a page in the Explorers Hall of Fame, a footnote in textbooks, but a giant in maritime grit. And speaking of unlikely vehicles crossing boundaries, let's now talk about the time the U.S. government tried to take the battlefield to the skies in a flying lawnmower with ambition. The flying Jeep that never flew. What if your Humvee could take off like a helicopter? That was the idea behind the Cold War-era flying Jeep, a bizarre borderline sci-fi experiment by the U.S. Army to create a vertical takeoff and landing (VTOL) vehicle for reconnaissance, light transport, and battlefield mobility. Dubbed the VZ series, the most infamous being the VZ-9 Avro car, these contraptions looked like something out of a low-budget alien movie. The Avro car in particular was essentially a flying saucer with a fan engine in the middle. The goal was simple: take off from anywhere, hover over danger, avoid landmines, and look cool doing it. It never worked. The controls were unstable. The lift was pitiful. It wobbled, shook, and hovered no more than a few feet off the ground. It couldn't carry much. It couldn't fly straight. It overheated. In short, it was a bad drone before drones were a thing. Still, the flying Jeep got a serious investment, millions in taxpayer dollars and years of development, before being scrapped as one of the weirder branches in the tree of military evolution. And while some generals were dreaming of airborne buggies, one American president found himself surprisingly alone at the top. No second in command, no backup plan, just Millard Fillmore and a vacant chair. Millard Fillmore, the lone president. Millard Fillmore is often remembered as the president, with a name like a Dickens side character and a legacy so faint it's like he was penciled into the historical margins. But one strange fact makes him stand out. He had no vice president. None. Not for a month, not for a year, for his entire term. Fillmore wasn't elected president. He was Zachary Taylor's VP and ascended to the office in 1850 when Taylor died suddenly after a suspiciously intense 4th of July snack. Possibly milk and cherries, but that's another story. Once in office, Fillmore simply never appointed a new VP, because back then there was no mechanism to do so. The Constitution didn't allow for a vice presidential replacement until the 25th Amendment passed over a century later. So Fillmore served solo, second seat empty, no understudy waiting in the wings. He spent his term managing pre-Civil War tensions, signing the Fugitive Slave Act, and watching his party implode. But structurally, his presidency highlights a weird blind spot in American governance. What happens when the guy who's supposed to be the backup becomes the lead, and there's no one left to call? From one-man shows to blackout chaos, the next moment in U.S. history flips the switch. Literally, the Great New York City Blackout of 1977. At 9:36 p.m. on July 13, 1977, the lights went out in New York City, and the darkness didn't just fall, it erupted. A lightning strike in the Hudson Valley triggered a cascade of electrical failures, plunging the entire city into a blackout that would last 25 hours. What followed was a night of chaos, crime, and cultural upheaval. Unlike the 1965 blackout, which had been strangely peaceful, the 1977 outage struck during a perfect storm of tension. The city was already teetering on financial collapse. Unemployment was high, and the heat was unbearable. So when the power went out, the powder keg ignited. Looters smashed windows. Fires were set. Over 1,600 stores were ransacked. The police made more than 3,700 arrests. Some neighborhoods looked like war zones by dawn. Brooklyn and the Bronx bore the brunt, with streets littered in broken glass and stolen merchandise. But the blackout didn't just reveal criminal desperation. It also became a turning point for a cultural underground. In the dim streets, DJs and dancers powered up generators and kept the music going. It was a night that paradoxically helped birth hip-hop. In the wreckage of chaos, creativity sparked. And while looters were stealing stereos in the dark, the 19th century saw its own brand of theft, but with barrels of booze and well-dressed bureaucrats. The Whiskey Ring Scandal. During Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, A massive corruption ring fermented right under the federal nose, and it all revolved around America's favorite liquid sin, whiskey. The scandal, known as the Whiskey Ring, unfolded in the 1870s and involved distillers, distributors, and, most damningly, government officials conspiring to cheat the Treasury out of millions in liquor taxes. Here's how it worked. Distillers would bribe Internal Revenue agents to underreport the amount of whiskey they produced. That meant less tax paid, more profits pocketed. Everyone in the ring got a cut, except Uncle Sam. The operation was slick, widespread, and ran through major cities like St. Louis, Chicago, and Milwaukee. When the scandal broke, it splashed straight into the Grant administration. The president himself wasn't involved, but his private secretary, Orville E. Babcock, was indicted. Grant, loyal to a fault, testified in Babcock's defense, the only sitting president to do so in a criminal trial. Babcock was acquitted, but the damage stuck. The Whiskey Ring wasn't just about taxes or booze. It was about trust. It cracked the illusion of post-war moral authority and added one more tarnish to an era already heavy with political grime. And from whiskey-soaked ledgers to helium-filled dreams, America's next experimental mail delivery system would lift off, or float, rather, into the absurd. Mail by balloon, the floating postal dream. Before airmail had wings, someone thought it should have helium. In the mid to late 1800s, and again in spurts through the early 20th century, the U.S. flirted with the idea of delivering mail by balloon. It was part innovation, part desperation, and all American. One of the earliest recorded attempts took place during the Civil War. Union forces used balloons for reconnaissance, and someone figured, if they can spy, they can ship. Enter the balloon post, a concept where letters were floated over enemy lines in bags tied to hot air or gas balloons. Spoiler, most of them ended up stuck in trees or lost in the wind. Fast forward to 1877, when aeronauts in Nebraska launched balloon mail demonstrations, some of which actually worked. Airmail was romantic, mysterious, and completely impractical. Balloons couldn't be steered. They were at the mercy of the breeze, which meant your letter might arrive in Des Moines or Denmark. Despite the concept being a windblown mess, balloon mail stuck around in experimental form, a novelty at fairs, an occasional gimmick during emergencies, but never a scalable solution. Eventually, planes stole the spotlight. But for a brief, weird window, Americans tried to turn the Postal Service into a floating circus act. Meanwhile, back on solid ground, one president used a brand new invention to connect with the future, even if there was no one on the other end. Rutherford B. Hayes and the presidential phone call. In 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes moved into the White House and made history, not with policy, but with a phone call, or at least a phone installation. Hayes became the first U.S. president to use a telephone, just a year after Alexander Graham Bell patented the device. The White House phone wasn't exactly buzzing with activity. The only other line it connected to was the Treasury Department. That's it, a direct line, not for gossip or emergencies, but likely awkward conversations about budgets and tariffs shouted into a primitive receiver. Hayes was reportedly fascinated by the tech. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just opened the door to a future where presidents would fire off tweets, stream campaign rallies, and answer nuclear launch codes via secure comms. Hayes started it all with a single line that barely worked and a number no one else could call. It was a modest step into a wired world. But where Hayes used technology to connect, a future inferno would sever everything, with flames so big the smoke reached Canada. The Great Fire of 1910, they called it the Big Blow-Up. In August 1910, the Pacific Northwest ignited in what remains one of the largest wildfires in U.S. history. Over just 2 days, flames devoured more than 3 million acres of forest across northeastern Washington, northern Idaho, and western Montana, an area the size of Connecticut. The fire wasn't one blaze. It was hundreds of smaller fires that merged, fed by drought, dry lightning, and gale-force winds. Towns vanished overnight. Entire landscapes were erased. The inferno moved faster than people could flee, with walls of fire leaping from tree to tree at 70 miles per hour. At least 86 people died, many of them firefighters, including the legendary Pulaski's Men. A crew led into a mine tunnel to survive the blast. The disaster helped birth the modern U.S. Forest Service, proving once and for all that fire wasn't just a tool of nature. It was a weapon of mass destruction if left unchecked. The Great Fire of 1910 left scars in the earth and in policy. And from the ashes of the frontier, the American dream would glitter again, this time in gold. The California Gold Rush. Boom towns and statehood. It started with a sparkle. In 1848, at Sutter's Mill in California, James W. Marshall spotted flecks of gold in the riverbed. Word spread faster than wildfire, and within months a tidal wave of prospectors, drifters, and dreamers surged westward. The California Gold Rush had begun, and America would never look the same. By 1849, over 80,000 people, the original 49ers, had flooded into the territory. San Francisco ballooned from a sleepy outpost into a booming port city. Tents became towns, towns became cities, and lawless chaos became infrastructure. Sort of. The rush brought instant diversity, with immigrants arriving from China, Mexico, and Europe, hoping to strike it rich. But the riches were uneven. Most didn't find gold. Instead, they found backbreaking labor, skyrocketing prices, and brutal frontier justice. Still, the population surge was undeniable. In just 2 years, California's non-native population exploded. By 1850, it skipped the territorial phase entirely and became a full-fledged state. The gold rush wasn't just about shiny rocks, it was about speed. It accelerated American expansion, fueled railroads, deepened native displacement, and made California a mythic land of promise and peril, a state born in a fever dream of fortune. And while the gold rush was loud with ambition, the Cold War military had another kind of volume in mind, one that could shatter crowds with sound. The sonic cannon, sound as a weapon. In the strange arsenal of crowd control tech, few things are more unnerving than the sonic cannon. During the Cold War and beyond, U.S. defense researchers experimented with the idea of using sound, not bullets, not gas, to control or disperse hostile groups. Enter the Long-Range Acoustic Device, LRAD, the closest thing we've ever built to a real-life sound weapon. Capable of emitting ear-splitting tones above 150 decibels, it could blast focused beams of sound to repel protesters, pirates, or even enemy troops. The result? Pain, disorientation, and in some cases, permanent hearing loss. Early sonic cannon concepts were tested for battlefield use and riot suppression. They were even reportedly used during modern conflicts in Iraq and at summits like the G20. The device doesn't explode. It screams, sending a piercing tone that physically incapacitates anyone in its path. It's non-lethal, but only technically, because pain, it turns out, is a pretty effective deterrent. And while the military used advanced physics to make people run, one president found his own way of keeping things stylish, specifically with enough wardrobe changes to fill a department store. Chester A. Arthur and the Presidential Pants Parade. Chester A. Arthur may not top most lists of memorable presidents, but sartorially, he was in a league of his own. The man owned 80 pairs of pants and rotated through them with the devotion of a runway model in the Gilded Age. Arthur, once a New York dandy and customs collector, believed in dressing well as a matter of national dignity. He had custom suits, silk vests, monogrammed accessories, and a grooming routine that would put modern influencers to shame. He even reportedly changed outfits multiple times per day. His obsession with appearance earned him the nickname the Gentleman Boss. And it wasn't just for show. After taking over from James Garfield, who was assassinated, Arthur shocked the political establishment by cleaning up corruption and supporting civil service reform, all while impeccably dressed. Arthur's style was more than vanity. It was strategy, a polished exterior to reflect a refined, reform-minded presidency. Because sometimes the most unexpected legacy starts at the hem of a perfectly tailored trouser. And next, we trade silk for smoke as we head into one of the most catastrophic blazes to ever tear through the heart of a historic American city, the Great Boston Fire of 1872. On the night of November 9th, 1872, a careless spark ignited a wooden building on Summer Street in downtown Boston. And within hours, the city was ablaze. The flames leapt from building to building, fed by high winds, dry timber, and the unforgiving architecture of a pre-modern metropolis. When it finally burned out 12 hours later, the Great Boston Fire had destroyed over 770 buildings and left a gaping, smoldering scar in the city's financial district. The devastation was biblical. Flames lit up the night sky as firemen, exhausted and under-equipped, battled the inferno with water pressure so weak it barely reached the rooftops. Streets turned to rivers of molten tar and broken brick. Looters crept through the rubble. The roar of collapsing buildings echoed like cannon fire. Despite the destruction, the death toll was miraculously low, around 20 people. But the financial damage was enormous, totaling over $70 million, roughly $1.5 billion today. Boston's economy reeled. Insurance companies collapsed under claims, and a hard lesson was learned about fire codes, building materials, and city planning. From its ashes rose a new Boston, tougher, smarter, fireproof. But if that blaze revealed the city's fragility, it was nothing compared to a much older paranoia that burned people, not buildings. The Salem witch trials, fear on trial. In 1692, in the puritanical fog of colonial Massachusetts, 20 people were executed based on little more than superstition, teenage hysteria, and good old-fashioned religious panic. The Salem witch trials remain one of the darkest, most surreal chapters in American legal history, a cautionary tale about what happens when fear takes the witness stand. It began with 2 young girls claiming to be afflicted by witches. Soon, more children joined in, convulsing, pointing fingers, and spinning tales of devilish torment. The colony panicked. Accusations flew. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Spectral evidence, dreams and visions, was admissible in court. If someone said they saw you consorting with demons in a dream, that was enough to hang you. By the end, 19 people were hanged. 1 was pressed to death with stones, and hundreds were imprisoned. The accused included farmers, ministers, and even a 4-year-old girl. All for crimes no one could prove, and many still deny ever committing. The hysteria eventually burned out, and the courts admitted error. But the damage was done. The Salem trials weren't just a witch hunt. They were a primitive form of cultural self-immolation, fueled by fear, conformity, and mass delusion. And while colonial paranoia once tore communities apart, a much later American dream would try to knit them back together. Not in the sky, but underground. The American Underground Tunnel fantasy. At various points throughout the 20th century, the U.S. seriously considered, and even started, building a vast network of underground transportation tunnels. Subways in cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago were just the beginning. Visionaries dreamed bigger, an entire subterranean America of highways, railroads, and even people movers that would operate beneath the chaos of modern life. The most audacious plans emerged during the Cold War. Some proposals called for nuclear-powered boring machines that could dig miles of tunnel per day. There were ideas for inner-city tube trains, military logistics highways, and even subterranean shelters in case of nuclear attack, all connected by a buried labyrinth of reinforced concrete. In the 1970s, the Urban Mass Transportation Administration looked into personal rapid transit, autonomous pods zipping through underground tubes. Cities like Dallas and Cincinnati broke ground on ambitious tunnel systems, only to run out of money, political will, or both. Today, these dreams live on in proposals by private companies and billionaires with drills. But the original government blueprints, optimistic, sci-fi, and occasionally insane, remain as echoes of a time when America thought it could dig its way to a more connected future. And next, we leave the tunnels behind and head to the White House bathroom, where a certain Texan president had a thing for multitasking in the most unfiltered way possible. Lyndon B. Johnson, Oval Office on the commode. Lyndon B. Johnson didn't believe in walls, especially not bathroom walls. The 36th President of the United States was known for a lot of things: civil rights legislation, the Vietnam quagmire, and his sheer, unfiltered Texan energy. But among White House staff, aides, and unfortunate journalists, he was also known for one very specific habit: conducting meetings while on the toilet. Yes, LBJ was famous for summoning people into the bathroom mid-business. He would leave the door open, make eye contact, continue dictating orders, and expect everyone to pretend nothing was happening. It wasn't a power move. It was the power move. A boundary-shattering, etiquette-defying flex from a man who had zero patience for formality. Johnson's presidency was chaotic and muscular. So was his style. He had a phone installed in the bathroom. He gave interviews from the throne. He even barked orders while being fitted for pants, once telling a tailor he needed more room in the crotch where my nuts hang. It was all classic LBJ, loud, crude, efficient, and unforgettable. But while Johnson was storming through policy from porcelain, the literal skies would one day unload a record-breaking blizzard that shut down the entire eastern seaboard. The Great East Coast Blizzard of 1996, January 1996. The new year had barely begun when the east coast of the United States was sucker-punched by one of the most brutal blizzards in modern memory. Snowfall totals reached up to 4 feet in some areas. Major cities, Philadelphia, D.C., New York, all went dark, silent, and buried under a blanket of white chaos. It wasn't just the snow. It was the speed, the volume, and the aftermath. Over 150 people died. Airports closed. Public transit ground to a halt. Even President Bill Clinton found himself snowed in, forced to shut down the federal government for days. Drifts climbed up windows, streets vanished. National Guard troops were deployed to rescue stranded motorists and deliver medical aid. Some neighborhoods didn't see plows for over a week. And when the snow finally started to melt, it caused record flooding across the Northeast. The 1996 blizzard didn't just paralyze. It redefined winter preparedness. Cities invested in more plows, better communication systems, and emergency supply networks. Because when nature dumps a continent's worth of snow in your backyard, you'd better learn to shovel fast. But as snow buried streets and shut down cities, another American story reminds us that not all trails are romantic. Some are carved in cruelty, soaked in tears. The Trail of Tears, forced march into history. Between 1830 and 1850, the U.S. government forcibly removed thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral homelands, pushing them westward into territory that was unfamiliar, unforgiving, and already occupied. This dark chapter, known as the Trail of Tears, wasn't one event, but a brutal series of forced relocations, primarily targeting the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. It was all made legal by the Indian Removal Act, signed by President Andrew Jackson in 1830. Framed as a policy of relocation, it was, in practice, ethnic cleansing. Entire communities were uprooted at gunpoint. They traveled by foot, wagon, and boat. Many were poorly clothed, underfed, and exposed to disease and exhaustion. The numbers are staggering. Over 100,000 Native Americans were displaced. Thousands died along the journey. Some say 4,000 Cherokee alone. The survivors arrived in what is now Oklahoma to find broken promises and barren land. The Trail of Tears isn't just a sorrowful footnote. It's a foundational injustice, a reminder that America's expansion was not only paved with ambition, but soaked in suffering. A trail that doesn't end, but echoes. In land, in memory, in legacy. And from tears of the past, we turn to the future the military tried to weaponize with something straight out of science fiction, the brain itself. The brain gun, America's mind-bending military experiment. In the deep classified corners of Cold War paranoia, the U.S. military flirted with an idea so bizarre it sounds like comic book villainy. A brain gun, a non-lethal weapon designed to incapacitate enemies by disrupting their neural functions. The goal? No bullets, no blood. Just an invisible, neurological takedown. This concept wasn't pure fiction. Military researchers explored technologies that could manipulate the human brain through directed energy, sound waves, or electromagnetic pulses. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, even studied whether psychotronic weapons, devices that could affect mood, perception, or cognition, were viable on the battlefield. Some proposed using infrasound to induce nausea or panic. Others speculated on microwave beams that could confuse brainwaves. Nothing was ever officially deployed, but documents from declassified programs show serious thought went into designing weapons that could disable consciousness without permanent physical harm. Of course, none of it proved reliably effective, and the ethical nightmare of mind manipulation made even the Pentagon squirm. But the fact that the idea got funding and attention speaks volumes about how far the U.S. was willing to go for an edge in the silent war of brains over brawn. And while one future weapon tried to hack minds, a past president quietly clung to a system of brutality that no law or conscience had yet dismantled. Zachary Taylor, the last slave-owning president in office. Zachary Taylor, the 12th president of the United States, was a decorated general, a Mexican-American war hero, and, in a stark contradiction to his short-lived role as a national leader, the last sitting president to own enslaved people. Taylor wasn't just a passive participant. He held more than 100 slaves across plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi. Even as the nation edged toward conflict over slavery's moral and constitutional implications, Taylor remained committed to the institution. Yet, paradoxically, he also opposed the expansion of slavery into newly acquired territories from the Mexican-American War, putting him at odds with the pro-slavery faction of his own party. He died just 16 months into his term, under sudden and suspicious circumstances, possibly linked to contaminated food or heat stroke, before those contradictions could fully collide. Taylor's presidency was brief, but his legacy highlights the uncomfortable reality that slavery didn't just exist in America. It existed inside the White House. And while political fog clouded the future, a literal fog once smothered an entire town in one of the nation's worst environmental disasters. The Great Smog of Donora, 1948. It didn't look like death at first, just another autumn mist settling over Donora, Pennsylvania, a steel mill town nestled in a valley. But by Halloween 1948, the air had become a thick, yellowish soup. It stung eyes, burned throats, and then people started collapsing. The Donora smog was a deadly cocktail of sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and metal particulates, trapped by a temperature inversion that acted like a lid over the town. Over 5 days, the poison built up. 20 people died. Hundreds were hospitalized. Thousands got sick. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't a bomb. It was air, the very thing we breathe, turned toxic by unregulated industry and atmospheric bad luck. Donora's mills and zinc plants had belched pollution for decades, but this time, nature didn't let it drift away. The smog ended when the weather finally shifted, but the damage lingered. It sparked national outrage and helped lay the groundwork for the Clean Air Act and the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency. Decades later, Donora became a grim symbol a town that choked on progress and lived just long enough to warn the rest of the country. And from polluted skies, we shift to glittering hope. The first gold, the first rush, the beginning of a fever that would reforge the West. James W. Marshall, the man who sparked a gold fever. On January 24, 1848, James W. Marshall looked down into the frigid waters of the American River near Sutter's Mill and saw a flash. Not a trick of light, not a fish, but a glint of gold. That glimmer would ignite the greatest migration in American history. But Marshall? He never struck it rich. Marshall was a carpenter overseeing construction at the mill when he noticed shiny flecks in the riverbed. He showed his employer, John Sutter, who tried to keep the discovery a secret. That failed spectacularly. Within months, the whisper of gold became a roar. Word spread eastward like wildfire. And by 1849, California was drowning in 49ers. Prospectors, gamblers, merchants, and opportunists all chasing wealth. Ironically, the two men who discovered the gold, Marshall and Sutter, ended up broke, overrun by squatters and swindled by history. They were trampled beneath the very rush they unleashed. But Marshall's legacy gleams brighter than any nugget. He lit the fuse that detonated America's westward expansion, changed global migration patterns, and forged California's identity in ore and chaos. And while Marshall stood by a river in 1848, the U.S. government once fantasized about bridging an entirely different body of water with steel, ambition, and a direct line to Siberia. The Bering Strait Bridge, a Cold War fantasy. At various points in the 20th and 21st centuries, planners and dreamers have proposed one of the most audacious infrastructure projects in human history. A bridge, or tunnel, spanning the Bering Strait, connecting Alaska to Russia. The idea? Build a physical link between the two continental superpowers across 55 miles of freezing, iceberg-filled water. On paper, it's theoretically possible. The Diomede Islands lie midway between the two coasts, one controlled by the U.S., the other by Russia, and could act as stepping stones. But the challenges are Herculean. Extreme weather, tectonic instability, political hostility, and the small matter of navigating international diplomacy during the Cold War. The most elaborate version, dubbed the Intercontinental Peace Bridge, would feature roadways, pipelines, and even rail lines. The estimated cost? Hundreds of billions. The likelihood? Close to zero. Still, the fact that it was seriously considered speaks volumes about America's hunger for connectivity, even with its ideological rival. Because if you could fly over it, dig under it, or drive across it, someone in Washington was going to pitch it. And speaking of taking flight, one president did more than just board a plane. He made history by skipping traffic and taking to the skies right from the South Lawn. Dwight D. Eisenhower, first president in a helicopter. On July 12, 1957, Dwight D. Eisenhower made history, not with a speech or a treaty, but with a quick liftoff. That day, he became the first sitting U.S. president to ride in a helicopter, officially turning the skies above the White House into presidential airspace. The flight wasn't just for show. It was a strategic shift in executive mobility. The Secret Service and the Department of Defense were testing faster, more flexible ways to transport the commander-in-chief, especially in the event of a nuclear attack. The chopper offered something new: vertical escape. Ike took off aboard a U.S. Army Bell UH-13J, flying from the White House lawn to Camp David. From that point forward, presidential travel would never be the same. The era of Marine One had begun. Today, the presidential helicopter is a symbol of power, a flying fortress of communications tech and security features. But it all started with a former general, a rotor blade, and a slow, choppy ascent into aviation history. And from flying high, we next hit bottom, as the Dust Bowl era sweeps across the plains with a vengeance, turning farms to deserts and dreams to dust. The Dust Bowl, America's black blizzard. In the 1930s, during the darkest days of the Great Depression, vast stretches of the American Great Plains transformed into a parched, howling wasteland. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a weather event. It was a man-made ecological apocalypse where overfarming, drought, and wind combined to turn topsoil into airborne death. Millions of acres across Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and beyond were devastated. Crops failed. Cattle choked. The skies turned black with dust storms so massive they were dubbed black blizzards. On some days it felt like night at noon. Children wore dust masks to school. Families stuffed wet towels under doors in a futile attempt to keep the grit out. Entire towns were swallowed in sand. Farmers became refugees. Over 2.5 million people fled the plains, many heading west to California in search of work, shelter, and hope. A migration immortalized in the Grapes of Wrath and real-life stories of dispossession and desperation. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a warning about greed, land misuse, and short-sighted policy, and it forced the government to act, launching the Soil Conservation Service and new farming techniques that emphasize sustainability. Because when your entire continent turns to dust, you learn quickly. But while nature raged outside, a cultural storm brewed in a Tennessee courtroom, where monkeys, science, and the Bible went head-to-head. The Scopes Monkey Trial, Science versus Scripture. In the summer of 1925, Dayton, Tennessee became the unlikely epicenter of a national showdown between science and religion. The Scopes Monkey Trial, officially the state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, put a high school teacher on trial for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution in violation of the newly passed Butler Act. The case was a circus. Reporters flooded the town. Merchants sold monkey dolls and evolution souvenirs. On one side, famed prosecutor William Jennings Bryan, a 3-time presidential candidate and fundamentalist Christian. On the other, defense attorney Clarence Darrow, an agnostic and legal firebrand. The trial wasn't about Scopes. It was about whether America would embrace modern science or cling to religious literalism. The defense never denied Scopes taught evolution. They wanted the law itself to be put on trial. In a dramatic moment, Darrow called Bryan to the stand as an expert on the Bible and grilled him on Genesis, exposing contradictions and interpretations. Scopes was convicted, fined $100, but the verdict was overturned on a technicality. Still, the cultural clash echoed for decades. The monkey trial was less about monkeys and more about America's identity. Reason versus faith. Progress versus tradition. And while the courtroom sparred over science, engineers elsewhere were dreaming of taking evolution to the skies, one personal plane at a time. The Flying Flivver, Ford's skybound folly. In the 1920s, while Ford was revolutionizing roads with the Model T, he also tried to revolutionize the skies with the Flying Flivver, a tiny personal aircraft that Henry Ford hoped would become the Model T of the air. It was small, light, and cheap. The Flivver was designed to be a flying car for the common man, a dream of private aviation, where everyone would one day zip from city to city without touching a highway. Ford even backed marketing campaigns and test flights to promote it. But the dream ended in tragedy. In 1928, pilot Harry Brooks, Ford's test flyer and close friend, crashed and died over the ocean while flying a Flivver prototype. The aircraft disappeared, never recovered. Ford, devastated, pulled the plug on the project. The Flying Flivver faded into a historical footnote, the flying car that wasn't. But its ambition never really died. The dream of personal flight still hovers just beyond the runway. And as America soared toward the future, one man stood alone, facing 2 pistols and certain death, only for fate to jam the trigger. Andrew Jackson and the luckiest misfire in history. On January 30th, 1835, President Andrew Jackson was leaving a funeral at the Capitol when a man emerged from the crowd and aimed a pistol at his chest. Click. Misfire. The assassin, Richard Lawrence, dropped the first weapon, pulled out a second, and fired again. Click. Another misfire. Jackson, ever the brawler, responded the way only Jackson could, by beating the would-be assassin senseless with his cane until security pulled him off. It was the first attempted assassination of a U.S. president and one of the most incredible close calls in political history. The odds of both pistols misfiring were astronomical. Later tests revealed they were in working condition, making the double misfire a near miraculous twist of fate, or a nightmare for firearm reliability standards. Lawrence was declared insane and institutionalized. Jackson, on the other hand, used the event to reinforce his image as an unkillable force of nature, a man who fought duels, took bullets, and walked away without flinching. The cane he used became as iconic as his veto pen. But while Jackson survived time's wrath, another generation of Americans briefly considered rewriting time itself, 1 week, 1 month, and 1 leap second at a time. America's almost adopted alternate calendar. During the early 20th century, America briefly flirted with the idea of ditching the Gregorian calendar in favor of something more regular, specifically the world calendar, a system that divided the year into 13 equal months of exactly 28 days each, with 1 or 2 extra blank days to round out the year. Supporters argued it made accounting, scheduling, and long-term planning easier. Each month would begin on the same weekday. Holidays would never shift. A global year day would sit outside the weekly cycle, giving the whole world a breather. Business leaders, educators, and even some government officials were intrigued. But religious groups pushed back hard. A blank day broke the 7-day Sabbath cycle, and the idea of a new world time system felt a bit too Orwellian for the average voter. Congress flirted with the change in the 1930s and again post-World War II, but it never gained traction. The world stuck with leap years, uneven months, and the eternal annoyance of figuring out whether March has 30 or 31 days. Still, it's a tantalizing what if. The idea that we were just a vote or two away from living in a 13-month math nerd utopia. And as calendar reform fizzled, another movement was rising. One that wanted not new dates, but new dollars. The free silver movement. Inflate everything. In the late 19th century, America was caught in a financial tug-of-war between 2 shiny metals, gold and silver. The free silver movement wanted to break the government's allegiance to the gold standard and start coining silver freely. Why? Simple. Inflation. The good kind if you were a debtor. Farmers, laborers, and small business owners were drowning in deflation. Prices were falling, wages were stagnant, and money was tight. They believed that by expanding the monetary base with silver, the government could increase liquidity, raise crop prices, and make debts easier to pay off. It was economic adrenaline for the working class. Opponents, mostly bankers, industrialists, and gold standard purists, warned it would destroy the dollar, destabilize trade, and plunge the economy into chaos. The debate came to a head in 1896 when populist candidate William Jennings Bryan delivered his legendary Cross of Gold speech, declaring that the working man should not be crucified on a cross of gold. It electrified his supporters and terrified everyone else. Bryan lost. Gold held. But the free silver movement left a deep imprint on American politics, laying the groundwork for later reforms and highlighting a fundamental clash between Wall Street and Main Street, a battle still very much alive. And as economic tides raged, the ground itself would heave in a shattering moment that cracked the very crust of America. The Great Alaska Earthquake of 1964. On March 27, 1964, Good Friday, the ground in Alaska didn't just shake. It ripped, tore, and reshaped the very map. The Great Alaska Earthquake remains the most powerful earthquake in U.S. history and the second strongest ever recorded globally, registering a staggering 9.2 on the Richter scale. It struck at 5:36 p.m. local time, just outside Anchorage, and lasted over 4 minutes, an eternity in seismic terms. Streets buckled, Buildings collapsed. Entire neighborhoods were swallowed as the earth slumped and cracked beneath them. Coastal towns were hit with tsunamis minutes later. One wave struck Valdez with such force it tore apart the entire harbor. More than 130 people died, mostly from the tsunamis that followed. But the devastation wasn't just physical, it was geological. The quake permanently altered the landscape. Parts of Alaska rose 30 feet. Other sections sank. The event revealed previously unknown information about plate tectonics and subduction zones, changing how we understand earthquakes today. And yet, amid the devastation, there was a kind of awe at the raw, untamable power of the planet. A force no bomb, no president, no treaty could stop. But as the earth shook, the skies remained America's next frontier. And one man was already carving his name into the heavens. Alan Shepard, first American to touch the stars, again. Let's say it twice, because it deserves repeating. Alan Shepard was the first American in space. On May 5, 1961, aboard a tiny capsule called Freedom 7, Shepard was launched 116 miles above Earth. The entire flight lasted just 15 minutes and 22 seconds. No orbit, no moon landing. Just a parabolic arc and a splashdown in the Atlantic. But those 15 minutes were historic. The Soviets had beaten the U.S. to space with Yuri Gagarin just weeks earlier, sparking panic and determination in equal measure. Shepard's flight was America's punchback, proof that the U.S. wasn't going to sit idly in Earth's gravity well. Shepard's calm, controlled demeanor and famous quote, "Let's light this candle," became an anthem for American ambition. He later returned to space in 1971 as commander of Apollo 14, becoming the fifth man to walk on the moon, and famously hitting golf balls across the lunar surface. Shepard was the first to cross that barrier. A passenger on the edge of space, carried on controlled explosions and Cold War competition. But back on Earth, another threat was lurking. Invisible, buried, and possibly forgotten. Dogs on the nuclear trail. In the realm of Cold War nightmares, few things were more terrifying than the phrase "lost nuclear weapon." Believe it or not, the U.S. military has misplaced several, and at one point seriously considered deploying trained dogs to help find them. The program involved teaching military dogs to sniff out traces of radioactive material or the chemical compounds used in nuclear weapons. Think bomb-sniffing K-9 units, except looking for devices capable of ending civilization. The idea was both desperate and brilliant. Dogs have a sense of smell 40 times more sensitive than humans. If they could be trained to recognize radioactive isotopes or specific explosive residues, they might succeed where machines failed, in forests, oceans, or debris fields. The program remained mostly experimental. Training was difficult, radiation tricky to simulate safely, and results were inconsistent. But the mere fact it was considered shows just how frantic Cold War planners were to prepare for the unthinkable. Nukes lost, dogs deployed. History doesn't always bark, but sometimes it does leave paw prints on the most dangerous pages. And now, from sniffing secrets to fathering 15, we step into the prolific, peculiar family tree of a president who couldn't stop creating legacies. John Tyler, the founding father of a family tree. If America's presidents were ranked by fertility alone, John Tyler would sit comfortably at the top. The 10th president of the United States fathered 15 children, the most of any U.S. president by a wide margin. His family life was less a household and more a private republic. Tyler had 8 children with his first wife, Letitia Christian Tyler, before she died while he was in office. 2 years later, at age 54, he married Julia Gardner, who was just 24. They had 7 more children, proving that Tyler wasn't just a constitutional anomaly, the first vice president to assume the presidency after a death, but a human embodiment of American expansion. Even weirder, As recently as the 2010 two of Tyler's grandsons were still alive. That's right. The man born in 1790 had grandkids alive during the Obama administration. The Tyler family timeline is a warp in American chronology, connecting the 18th century directly to the 21st. He governed in a turbulent time. But when it came to personal legacy, Tyler went nuclear. And speaking of things buried for the public good, America once took an awkwardly enormous problem and shoved it underground. Literally. The Great Kills Park whale burial. In 1980, residents of Staten Island encountered a problem not even New York's sarcasm could handle. A dead whale washed up near Great Kills Park. It was massive, bloated, and rotting fast, threatening to turn an already pungent summer into an environmental crime scene. What did officials do? The most American thing possible. They buried it. Bulldozers were called in. A pit was dug, and the carcass was entombed like an ancient sea god beneath the sand of Great Kills Park. No ceremony, no plaque, just a quiet whale funeral attended by flies and city workers with strong stomachs. The plan was simple. Let nature handle it. But nature, as it often does, had other ideas. Over time, parts of the whale began resurfacing. Bones, blubber, unpleasant reminders. The burial became a bizarre piece of urban lore. Locals joked that the park was haunted. Scientists sighed. Eventually, the site was sealed, fenced off, and turned into a cautionary tale about what not to do with 60 tons of dead mammal. And while that story sank into the soil, another mystery, far older and far more seductive, kept American explorers up at night, chasing shadows through the jungle. The lost city of Z, America's jungle obsession. In the early 20th century, as the age of exploration wound down, one last mystery loomed. The lost city of Z, a supposed ancient metropolis buried deep in the Amazon, rich with gold, knowledge, or maybe even an advanced civilization forgotten by time. The idea captivated Percy Fawcett, a British explorer whose obsession became America's too. Sponsored by the Royal Geographic Society, and later, indirectly, by American donors and media outlets, Fawcett's expeditions were followed breathlessly by readers in the U.S. newspapers dubbed him the next Indiana Jones. Before Indy was even a gleam in Spielberg's eye, Fawcett vanished in 1925, and the mystery only deepened. Over the decades, American adventurers, treasure hunters, and researchers ventured into the jungle to find him, or Z. They found mosquitoes, hostile terrain, and disappointment. But they also found ruins, pottery, roads, evidence that the idea of complex Amazonian civilizations wasn't pure fantasy. Today, archaeologists using LiDAR have discovered vast networks of ancient Amazonian settlements, proving that the myth of Z may have been closer to truth than anyone imagined. What began as legend turned into science, a transformation that America, ever hungry for discovery, couldn't resist. And from jungle cities to hurricane factories, next we explore the technology that aimed to do the impossible, control the weather itself. Weather control, America's storm-taming ambitions. Controlling the weather sounds like a plot ripped from a comic book, or a Bond villain's weekend project. But for decades, the U.S. government seriously tried to manipulate storms. The most famous effort? Project Storm Fury, a Cold War-era initiative that aimed to weaken hurricanes using science, silver iodide, and sheer audacity. The plan was deceptively simple. Seed the outer rain bands of hurricanes with chemicals that would cause supercooled water to freeze, redistribute the storm's energy, and, in theory, reduce its destructive power. Think of it as meteorological acupuncture. Poke the right cloud, and the beast calms down. Between the 1960s and 1980s, the U.S. flew dozens of missions into actual hurricanes. There were some promising results, but nothing conclusive. Nature didn't always cooperate, and proving causality in a system as complex as a hurricane turned out to be next to impossible. Eventually, Storm Fury was grounded, but the dream didn't die. From cloud seeding to hail suppression and even earthquake-triggering speculation, Weather control has remained a fringe but enduring fascination in American defense and disaster strategy circles. Because if you could control the skies, you could control the battlefield. And when battle broke out in Chicago in 1886, it wasn't nature that exploded. It was ideology, chaos, and a homemade bomb. The Haymarket Affair, bombs, blood, and the birth of May Day. May 4th, 1886. A peaceful labor rally in Haymarket Square, Chicago, turned violent in a flash and changed American labor forever. The rally was organized to support striking workers demanding an 8-hour workday, a radical idea at the time. But as police moved in to disperse the crowd, someone threw a bomb. The explosion killed 7 police officers and at least 4 civilians. Dozens were injured. Chaos erupted. Gunfire followed. The bomber was never identified, but the response was swift and severe. 8 anarchists were arrested despite weak evidence. 4 were hanged. 1 committed suicide in jail. The trials were a spectacle, more about punishing political dissent than establishing guilt. Public opinion split violently. Were the defendants martyrs or monsters? The Haymarket Affair became a global symbol of worker solidarity and government repression. It birthed International Workers' Day, observed every May 1st, especially outside the U.S., and galvanized the labor movement for generations. Chicago cleaned up the blood. The unions kept marching. And in the ashes of revolution, the American military looked up, toward the skies, and the ultimate flex in airborne engineering. The airship carrier, floating fortresses of the sky. Imagine a massive dirigible, silently cruising at 5,000 feet, carrying its own miniature airplanes inside its belly. In the 1930s, the U.S. Navy didn't just imagine this. They built it, twice. The USS Akron and USS Macon were airship carriers, flying aircraft hangars that could launch and recover scout planes midair. These weren't blimps. They were helium-filled giants, over 700 feet long, packed with cutting-edge tech for the era. Each airship carried up to 5 tiny fighter planes called Sparrowhawks, which could be released and retrieved through a trapeze system that was equal parts genius and madness. The concept was born out of necessity. Before radar, having aerial scouts with enormous range was vital. The airships gave the Navy eyes hundreds of miles in every direction. But like many ambitious experiments, it was doomed by nature and engineering limits. The Akron crashed in a storm in 1933, killing 73 of the 76 men aboard. The Macon followed 2 years later after structural failure. Both disasters ended the dream of airborne aircraft carriers, at least for the time being. Still, the airship carriers remain a symbol of America's sky-high ambition. Floating leviathans that prove the only thing more dangerous than dreaming big is trying to catch a falling dream. Next up, the first presidential joyride in a car, and the tragic ending that followed. William McKinley and the first presidential car ride. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was roaring into the modern era on a wave of gears, gasoline, and combustion. Right at the front of this mechanical revolution was President William McKinley, the first U.S. president to ever ride in an automobile. It was 1901. The car? A Stanley steamer. A sleek, steam-powered marvel that hissed and clattered more like a locomotive than a limo. McKinley wasn't known for being a tech junkie, but he understood symbolism. That short, historic ride sent a clear message. The presidency, like the country, was speeding into the future. Tragically, the ride would be among his last firsts. Just months later, McKinley was assassinated at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. His vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, would step into the role and the modern presidency, with both boots and handlebars blazing. Still, McKinley's brief stint in the backseat of progress was a quiet milestone. In a few decades, presidents wouldn't just ride in cars. They'd campaign from them, give speeches from them, and be judged on what model they preferred. And speaking of things flowing through city streets, America once faced a much stickier disaster in the heart of Boston. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919. On January 15, 1919, the north end of Boston was drowned. Not in water, but in molasses. A 2.3 million gallon storage tank burst, unleashing a tsunami of thick, sticky syrup into the streets. The wave moved at 35 miles per hour and stood 25 feet tall, flattening buildings, overturning train cars, and crushing everything in its path. 21 people died. Over 150 were injured, and cleanup took months. Rescue workers had to wade through gooey sludge to find victims. Horses were trapped like flies in amber. The molasses soaked into cobblestones, basements, and even history itself. Bostonians claimed you could still smell it decades later on hot summer days. Why did it happen? The tank was poorly built, rarely inspected, and overfilled. Temperatures had warmed suddenly, expanding the fermenting molasses inside and creating pressure the tank couldn't handle. It exploded with the force of a bomb, followed by a slow-motion avalanche of sugary doom. The disaster led to new regulations on construction and safety inspections. And for a while, it turned molasses, usually associated with grandma's cookies, into a word of urban terror. But while molasses stuck to buildings, America's darkest legacy stuck to its very foundations, carried across oceans in chains. The Great Atlantic Slave Trade, America's original sin. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, over 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean in one of history's largest and most horrific human trafficking operations, the Atlantic Slave Trade. Of those millions, an estimated 400,000 were brought directly to what would become the United States. The Middle Passage was hell on water. People were packed below decks like cargo, chained, starved, beaten, diseased. Mortality rates soared, and those who survived faced a lifetime of bondage, brutality, and generational trauma on American soil. Slavery became an engine of American prosperity. Cotton, tobacco, sugar, all built on stolen labor and systemic violence. Entire industries, even in the North, profited from it. Banks, insurance companies, and universities trace their origins to wealth created through slavery. The legacy still lingers in every corner of American life, from law enforcement to housing to wealth disparity. It wasn't just a crime of the past. It's a shadow still stretching across the present. And while millions were stolen from their homeland, the U.S. military once tried to borrow from nature itself, unleashing birds of prey to protect bases from an entirely different kind of airborne threat. Falcons on patrol, nature's anti-air defense. During the Cold War, the U.S. military explored some truly wild ideas. Among the most elegant, and perhaps medieval, was the use of trained falcons to patrol air bases and scare off nuisance birds. Because sometimes high-tech radar isn't as effective as a well-aimed beak and talons. Birds are a serious hazard to aircraft. Bird strikes can destroy engines, crack windshields, and turn takeoffs into disasters. So the Air Force turned to one of nature's oldest airborne predators, the falcon. Their presence alone could scatter flocks of geese, gulls, or pigeons. Trained handlers used them to keep runways clear and skies safe. The falcons were precise, low maintenance, and highly effective, a kind of eco-friendly missile defense system. Some bases still use them today, along with other natural deterrents like border collies and fake predator calls. So yes, the military really employed tiny feathered mercenaries. And while falcons soared above America's tarmacs, another commander-in-chief was locked in battle with vegetables. George H.W. Bush versus broccoli. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush made headlines for a very specific executive order. He banned broccoli from Air Force One. "I do not like broccoli," he declared, "and I haven't liked it since I was a little kid. And my mother made me eat it. And now I'm President of the United States, and I'm not going to eat any more broccoli." With that, broccoli was exiled from presidential cuisine. The nation reacted with a mix of amusement and agricultural offense. Broccoli farmers literally sent 10 tons of the vegetable to the White House in protest. The media had a field day, but Bush didn't back down. His stance was clear. No florets, no forgiveness. It became a defining moment of quirky presidential personality, a reminder that behind the nuclear codes and policy briefings, presidents are still just people with very strong food preferences. And while Bush drew a line in the sand against cruciferous greens, architects in Minnesota once proposed drawing a line against winter itself. With a structure so big, so bold, it could have swallowed a city whole, the Dome City of Minnesota. Ice Age urban planning. In the 1970s, as energy prices spiked and winters raged on, a radical idea emerged from the snowdrifts of Minnesota. Build a massive domed city to shelter residents from the brutal cold. Think Biosphere meets Blade Runner, with heating systems, controlled weather, and climate-regulated sidewalks, all under one gigantic, transparent roof. The concept was pitched for Hibbing, Minnesota, and it wasn't just architectural fantasy. Engineers drew up detailed plans. Environmentalists backed the energy efficiency. Politicians saw headlines. The idea was that by enclosing a city, residents could live, shop, and work without ever having to face minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit winds or dig out their cars after a blizzard. The dome would have been more than a roof. It would have been a new way of living, separating people from the raw, unpredictable climate outside. But as with many utopian dreams, reality hit hard. Cost estimates soared. Engineering challenges piled up. Public interest cooled faster than a Minneapolis sidewalk in February. The dome never happened, but the dream of climate-proof cities persists, echoed in sci-fi movies, urban planning think tanks, and every cold soul who's ever wondered, what if the sky had a thermostat? And from domes to diplomacy, we now shift to the moment America was nearly dragged into war over a dinner conversation, bribes, and 3 Frenchmen known only by letters. The XYZ affair, diplomacy, deception, and the quasi-war. In 1797, America was a young republic trying to navigate the dangerous waters of global politics, and it sailed straight into a scandal. The XYZ affair began as a diplomatic mission to patch things up with France, which was furious over U.S. neutrality during its war with Britain. President John Adams sent envoys to negotiate peace. What they got instead was a bribe request. 3 anonymous French agents, referred to as X, Y, and Z in official documents, demanded hefty payments just to begin negotiations. The Americans were shocked. This wasn't diplomacy. It was extortion. Word got back to the States and the public erupted in outrage. The phrase, "millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," became the rallying cry. The fallout was immediate. The U.S. canceled its treaties with France and launched an undeclared naval conflict known as the Quasi-War. American ships clashed with French privateers in the Atlantic, marking one of the first times that the U.S. flexed its maritime muscle as a sovereign power. The incident solidified Adams's image as a man of principle and deepened the rift between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. It also reminded Europe that the U.S. wasn't a pushover, even if it was still figuring out how to play the global chessboard. And while humans were busy sabotaging peace, the U.S. turned its attention to language and whether a different species could learn to speak. Monkeys and sign language. Science gets chatty. In a quiet corner of American research, scientists once asked a bold question. Can we teach monkeys to talk? The answer, at least partially, was yes, if you use your hands. Starting in the 1960s, researchers began teaching American Sign Language, ASL, to primates in a bid to explore the nature of language, consciousness, and interspecies communication. While chimps like Washoe and gorillas like Coco became household names, the U.S. also experimented with monkeys, particularly chimpanzees and bonobos, to see if language could be taught outside the human brain. The results were fascinating and at times surprisingly emotional. Some primates learned hundreds of signs. They could express basic emotions, make requests, and even lie, an indicator of cognitive complexity. One bonobo, Kanzi, even demonstrated the ability to understand spoken English and respond with lexigrams, which are visual symbols. But it wasn't all breakthroughs. Critics argued the primates were mimicking rather than communicating. Others warned of anthropomorphism. Still, the research challenged our understanding of what it means to think, to feel, and to be self-aware, blurring the line between human and animal in the most profound way. And while monkeys were learning to speak, America's bridges were getting a silent upgrade, none more iconic than the one named after the nation's first president, George Washington Bridge, the secret second deck. Spanning the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey, the George Washington Bridge is a monument to steel, traffic, and hidden potential. When it opened in 1931, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world, and it had a secret. It was designed from the start to include a second deck, though it wouldn't be completed for another 31 years. At first, only the upper level was used, carrying 6 lanes of traffic. But the engineers knew New York's appetite for vehicles was insatiable, so they future-proofed the design, building the towers strong enough to hold a second roadway beneath. By 1962, with congestion surging, the lower deck was finally added, known today as Martha, because George needed a partner, of course. Now, with 14 lanes, the bridge carries over 100 million vehicles a year, a concrete artery pulsing with commuters, deliveries, and horn-blasting chaos. It stands as a testament to foresight, functionality, and the sheer scale of American infrastructure. And so, we end, not with a bang or a war, but with the quiet hum of rubber on steel, a reminder that history doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just merges.